The rifle barrel pressed cold against Caleb Hartley's temple, and in that frozen Montana twilight, he made his choice: survival over sentiment, again. 3 men wanted him dead for sins he'd committed in another life, but it wasn't the gun that terrified him. It was the woman watching from the mercantile window, her eyes finding his through the chaos, seeing something in him he'd buried years ago. In that heartbeat, Caleb understood. He could run from bullets, but he couldn't outrun what Eleanor Whitman's gaze had just awakened. Stay with me through this journey of love, survival, and redemption on the 1879 Montana frontier. If this story touches you, hit that like button and comment with your city. I want to see how far our tale travels across the world. The fire that took Caleb Hartley's childhood didn't announce itself with mercy or warning. It came in the dead hours of an October night in 1866, when he was 11 years old, hungry with the kind of flame that devours not just timber and cloth, but futures and innocence. He woke to his mother screaming, not words, just pure animal terror, and the ceiling above his bed had already begun to glow orange like the belly of some hellish creature. His father never made it out of the bedroom. His mother pushed Caleb through a window, the glass tearing his nightshirt and skin, and he landed in dirt that smelled of rain and ash. She promised she'd follow. She lied, though not intentionally. The house collapsed inward with a sound like the earth breaking, and Caleb stood there in his bare feet, watching everything he'd known become smoke and cinder. The neighbors found him at dawn, still standing in the same spot, covered in soot, silent. They said he didn't cry. They said he didn't speak for 3 weeks. What they didn't know was that in those flames, Caleb Hartley had learned the frontier's first and most brutal lesson. Love is kindling, and the world is full of matches. The years that followed taught him variations on the same theme. The aunt and uncle who took him in, distant relations who saw him as free labor, worked him like a mule and fed him like an afterthought. When he was 14, he ran. Spent 2 winters doing odd jobs at a ranch in Wyoming, where the foreman, a grizzled man named Dutch, treated him almost like a son. Dutch taught him to rope, to read cattle, to shoot straight, taught him to trust again, slowly, carefully, the way you'd coax a wild horse. Then Dutch took a bullet meant for someone else during a dispute over water rights, and Caleb held him while he bled out in the dust. The older man's last words a rasping, "Don't let this place make you hard, boy." Too late for that. By the time Caleb turned 18, he'd developed a philosophy as stark and simple as the landscape. Everyone you love is a hostage to fate. Every connection is a potential wound. The solution was obvious: sever the possibility of connection entirely. He hired on with different outfits, never staying longer than a season. He was good at the work, better than good. Strong, tireless, and smart enough to learn quickly, but never smart enough to threaten the men above him. He saved his wages with a discipline that bordered on obsession, sleeping on the ground when others rented beds, eating beans and hardtack when others spent money on restaurant meals and whiskey. The men he worked alongside called him Cold Caleb, Ghost, the quiet one. He didn't care. Names didn't stick to people who refused to be known. But he wasn't a ghost. Inside the armor he'd welded around himself, there was still a man who remembered what warmth felt like, who sometimes woke in the night reaching for a mother's hand that had been ash for 14 years. He'd learned to ignore that man, to starve him of acknowledgement the way his aunt and uncle had starved him of affection. It worked, mostly. By 1879, at 25 years old, Caleb had accumulated enough money to buy what he truly wanted: distance. A land speculator in Billings had told him about a parcel 2 days' ride northwest of Silver Ridge, 300 acres of wilderness butting up against the Rocky Mountain foothills, so remote that even the Indians didn't bother with it anymore. It had water, timber, and most importantly, no neighbors within a day's ride. Perfect. He'd made up his mind to buy it, build a small cabin, run some cattle, and live out his days in the kind of solitude that couldn't be taken away because it couldn't be shared to begin with. He'd be 30, 40, 50 years old out there, and he'd die having never given the world another chance to rip his heart out. The plan was flawless in its simplicity. Then he rode into Silver Ridge on a May morning that smelled of pine and creek water, intending to stay only long enough to finalize the land purchase, and everything he thought he knew about survival began to crack apart. Silver Ridge in 1879 wasn't much. a main street of weathered storefronts, a saloon that leaned slightly to the left, a church that leaned slightly to the right, and maybe 300 souls scratching out existence between the mountains and the plains. It was the kind of town men rode through on their way to somewhere else, except there usually wasn't anywhere else worth going to. Caleb hitched his horse outside the land office and stepped into the dim, paper-cluttered interior where a clerk with ink-stained fingers processed his purchase with bureaucratic indifference. The transaction took 20 minutes. Caleb signed papers, transferred funds, received a deed that represented his future of intentional isolation. "You know that land's pretty raw," the clerk offered, not looking up. "No structures. You'll be building from scratch." "That's the point." "Nearest neighbor is old Tom Hutchins, about 15 miles east. Keeps to himself mostly. You'll fit right in." Caleb didn't respond. He folded the deed carefully, tucked it inside his vest, and walked out into the brightness of midday. His plan was to get supplies, nails, tools, basic provisions, and leave town before sunset. He'd camp on his new land tonight, start work on a cabin tomorrow. The faster he disappeared into his chosen exile, the better. He was halfway to the general store when the commotion started. A woman's voice, raised but controlled. "I said no, Mr. Deakins, and I meant it." A man's voice, thick with alcohol even at noon. "Come on, Eleanor, don't be like that. Your daddy owes me from that poker game, and I'm willing to take payment in—" "You'll take nothing. Now step aside." Caleb's boots slowed. His instincts, honed by years of avoiding other people's trouble, told him to keep walking. This wasn't his town, wasn't his business, wasn't his concern. But something in the woman's voice, the steel beneath the courtesy, the refusal to show fear, made him turn his head. The scene was unfolding outside the mercantile. A woman in a simple gray dress stood on the wooden sidewalk, a basket of goods in her arms, facing a man who was blocking her path. He was big, unsteady, with the red-faced look of someone who'd started drinking before breakfast. Two of his friends flanked him, grinning like this was entertainment. "Your daddy shouldn't have bet what he couldn't afford to lose," Deakins said, reaching for the basket. The woman, Eleanor, apparently, shifted the basket out of reach with a smooth motion that suggested this wasn't her first such encounter. "My father's debts are his own, and they certainly don't include me. Now move." "Feisty," Deakins grinned. "I like that." That's when Caleb's feet made the decision his mind was still arguing against. He found himself walking toward them, his hand resting naturally on the grip of the Colt revolver at his hip. Not a threat, just a presence. "Lady says move," Caleb said quietly. Deakins turned, swaying slightly. "This ain't your concern, stranger." "It is now." For a long moment, the street held its breath. Deakins was drunk, but not stupid. He saw something in Caleb's eyes. Maybe the flatness, the absolute absence of bluff or hesitation, and his survival instinct pierced through the whiskey fog. "Ain't worth it," one of his friends muttered. Deakins spat in the dirt, a gesture of defiance that cost him nothing. "You're right. She ain't worth the trouble anyway." He stepped aside and his companions followed him toward the saloon, their laughter forced and brittle. Caleb didn't watch them go. He was looking at the woman. Eleanor Whitman was not beautiful in the conventional way that made men stupid. She was something more unsettling than that. Striking, intelligent, with dark hair pulled back in a practical manner and eyes the color of winter rivers. Those eyes were currently studying him with an intensity that made him want to step back. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was educated, Eastern maybe, but worn smooth by time out west. That was unnecessary, but appreciated. Seemed necessary enough? Perhaps. She shifted the basket to her hip. "I'm Eleanor Whitman. My father's the town doctor." "Caleb Hartley." He touched the brim of his hat, already preparing to walk away. "You're new here?" "Just passing through." Something flickered across her face. Disappointment, maybe, or recognition of a familiar lie. Of course. Everyone's just passing through. Before he could respond, an older man emerged from the doctor's office across the street, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was thin, gray-haired, with the permanently tired look of someone who'd seen too much suffering with too few tools to combat it. "Eleanor, I heard—" He saw Caleb, assessed the situation with quick intelligence. "Deakins again?" Nothing I couldn't handle, Father. But you shouldn't have to handle it. The doctor's voice carried frustration born of repetition. He turned to Caleb. I'm grateful for your intervention, Mr. Hartley. And it was nothing. It wasn't nothing to me, Eleanor said. Her gaze hadn't left his face, and Caleb found it distinctly uncomfortable. It was as if she was reading something in him he'd worked years to encrypt. We'd like to offer you dinner, the doctor continued. It's the least we can do, and Eleanor's a fine cook. Thank you, but I need to get supplies and head out. Head out where? Eleanor asked. Bought some land northwest of here. Planning to settle. By yourself? The doctor looked concerned. That's rough country. Isolated. That's the point, Caleb said for the second time that day. Eleanor's expression shifted. Not judgment, but something closer to recognition. I understand that impulse, she said quietly. More than you might think. The statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Caleb didn't want to explore. He nodded politely, touched his hat again, and this time actually managed to walk away. But as he gathered supplies in the general store, nails, rope, beans, coffee, ammunition, he found his thoughts returning to Eleanor Whitman's eyes. They'd looked at him the way no one had looked at him in years. Not through him, not past him, but at him. As if she could see the man he used to be underneath the man he'd made himself become. It was dangerous. It was precisely what he'd come to Silver Ridge to avoid. He loaded his supplies onto his horse with methodical efficiency, checked the deed one more time, and prepared to ride northwest toward his purchased solitude. Then he heard the gunshots. 3 sharp cracks close together, the rhythm of violence, not hunting. They came from the north end of town, near the trail that led into the foothills. Caleb's hands stilled on his saddlebags. Not your problem, he thought. You intervened once today. That's your quota for a lifetime. But his body wasn't listening to his carefully constructed philosophy. His body was already moving, swinging into the saddle, urging his horse toward the sound. He found them half a mile out of town, where the road narrowed between pine-covered slopes. 2 men on horseback had a wagon stopped, the driver on the ground, not moving. The wagon's single passenger, a man with a medical bag clutched in his arms, stood with his hands raised. Dr. Whitman. Please, the doctor was saying, take the morphine, take whatever medical supplies you can sell. Just let me... Shut up. The first bandit was young, twitchy, with the desperate look of someone who'd crossed too many lines to go back. His gun was pointed at the doctor's chest. We know you got money. Towns always pay doctors. I have $17. It's in my coat pocket. $17? The second bandit laughed, older, scarred, meaner. You hear that, Clem? $17. He's lying. I'm not... The scarred man fired into the ground near the doctor's feet. Next one goes higher. Caleb had emerged from the tree line without conscious thought. He sat on his horse 30 yards away, perfectly still, evaluating angles and odds with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through years of frontier violence. 2 armed men, both mounted, both focused on the doctor. Neither had noticed him yet. He could still ride away. Should ride away. This wasn't his fight. Dr. Whitman was nothing to him. Eleanor was nothing to him. Silver Ridge was a place he'd been intending to leave permanently in the next 10 minutes. Then he thought of Eleanor's eyes. Not the way they'd looked at him, but the way they'd look if her father didn't come home. He'd seen that look before, in a mirror, in the months after the fire. It was a look that hollowed you out from the inside. Damn it. Caleb drew his Colt with his right hand, his rifle with his left, a trick Dutch had taught him, back when he'd believed the world might contain people worth learning from. He urged his horse forward at a walk, making no attempt at stealth. The older bandit heard him first, turning in his saddle with his gun swinging around. Federal Marshal, Caleb lied with absolute conviction. Put down your weapons. It was a gamble. Out here, federal authority was mostly theoretical, but the badge carried weight in desperate men's imaginations. Sometimes the lie was enough. Not today. The young one, Clem, panicked and fired. The bullet went wild, and Caleb's rifle answered, catching Clem in the shoulder and spinning him out of his saddle. The older man was faster, smarter, already moving behind the wagon for cover, but Caleb had expected that. He'd fired low, not to kill, but to disable. The older bandit got one more shot off before Caleb's revolver barked twice. The first shot took the man in the leg. The second shot killed the horse he'd been using for cover, and the animal's collapse trapped him beneath its weight. The whole thing took maybe 10 seconds. In the ringing silence that followed, smoke hung in the air like judgment. Caleb dismounted, keeping both guns ready, and approached the downed men. Clem was conscious, but in shock, clutching his shoulder. The older man was pinned, cursing, his gun out of reach. Dr. Whitman stood frozen, his hand still raised, his face pale. "You all right?" Caleb asked. The doctor nodded, unable to speak. "Your driver?" I think he's just unconscious. They hit him when he tried to reach for something." Caleb checked. The driver had a nasty gash on his head but was breathing steadily. He'd have a hell of a headache, but he'd live. "We need to get the sheriff," Dr. Whitman said, finding his voice. "And I need to treat these men's wounds. Your wagons still work?" "I believe so." "Then get in it. I'll tie these two to their horse and bring them in. You focus on getting yourself and your driver back safe." As the doctor moved to comply, he stopped and looked at Caleb with something approaching awe. "You said you were a federal marshal." "I lied." "Then why?" "Doesn't matter. Let's move before their friends show up." They made it back to Silver Ridge as the sun was beginning its descent toward the mountains. A crowd gathered immediately, the kind of crowd that materializes when violence disrupts the tedium of frontier life. The sheriff, a competent-looking man named Garrett, took custody of the wounded bandits and listened to Dr. Whitman's account with increasing interest. "The Deacons gang," Sheriff Garrett said, studying the older bandit's face. "You got Vernon Deacons himself. There's a $300 bounty on him out of Helena." "Don't want it," Caleb said. "Don't want—" The sheriff looked confused. "Son, $300 is— give it to the doctor, for whatever charity he thinks needs it." Before Sheriff Garrett could respond, Eleanor pushed through the crowd. She'd heard. Of course she'd heard. In a town this small, news traveled faster than bullets. She went straight to her father, checking him over with professional efficiency despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm fine, Eleanor, I'm fine. Thanks to Mr. Hartley here." Eleanor turned, and when her eyes found Caleb's, there was something in them that made his carefully constructed armor crack just a little bit more. "You saved his life," she said. It wasn't a question. "I slowed down some men who needed slowing." "You did more than that." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in those winter river eyes. "You could have died." "But I didn't." "Why?" The question was barely a whisper. "You said you were just passing through. You said you were heading to your land. Why did you come back?" Caleb didn't have an answer he was willing to give her. The truth, that he'd thought of how she'd look grieving her father, that some part of him too stubborn to die completely had refused to let that happen, was too revealing, too dangerous. "Heard gunshots," he said instead. "Seemed worth checking." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, and Caleb had the unsettling feeling that she knew exactly what he wasn't saying. "Will you stay?" she asked. "For dinner, at least, after what you've done." "I need to Please," Dr. Whitman interjected. "Mr. Hartley, I insist. You've saved my life twice in one day, once from those bandits and once from having to tell my daughter I wasn't coming home. The least you can do is let us feed you." Caleb looked at Eleanor, then at the doctor, then at the crowd of townspeople watching with open curiosity. Every instinct screamed at him to decline, to get on his horse, to ride northwest into the wilderness and the safety of solitude. But standing there in the fading Montana sunlight, with Eleanor Whitman's eyes still on his face, he found himself saying, "All right, one dinner." It was the first crack in his foundation, though he didn't know it yet. The beginning of something that would shatter every wall he'd built, every rule he'd lived by, every carefully maintained distance he'd relied on for survival. One dinner. What could possibly go wrong? The Whitmans lived in a modest house adjacent to the doctor's office. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 up, with a covered porch that faced west toward the mountains. It wasn't much, but it was clean and cared for in a way that spoke of limited resources deployed with maximum efficiency. Eleanor cooked while her father tended to the wagon driver's head wound in the office next door. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, acutely aware that this was the first time in years he'd been in a real home, with a woman cooking a real meal in a setting that mimicked the normalcy he'd spent a decade avoiding. "I apologize for the humble fare," Eleanor said, working at the stove with practiced movements. "I wasn't expecting company." "It's fine." "Do you cook for yourself, Mr. Hartley?" Caleb. And yes, badly. A small smile touched her lips. "Honesty, that's refreshing." "Is it?" "Out here? Absolutely. Most men I meet lie reflexively about their past, their prospects, their intentions." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You lied to those bandits about being a marshal, but you told my father the truth immediately after. That's unusual." "Lying to criminals isn't the same as lying to decent people." "And you can tell the difference?" "Usually." She brought 2 plates to the table, chicken, potatoes, carrots, all simple but well prepared. The smell alone made Caleb's mouth water. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten something that hadn't come from a can or a campfire. Dr. Whitman joined them as they started eating. He'd changed into a clean shirt and looked more composed than he had on the trail, though his hand still shook slightly when he lifted his fork. "I've been thinking about what happened today," the doctor said. "About what might have happened if you hadn't intervened." "Best not to think about that," Caleb said. "Eleanor would have been alone, in this town, a woman alone." The doctor's voice caught. "Her mother died 3 years ago. Typhoid. She's all I have left." "Father," Eleanor's voice held a note of warning. "I'm just saying Mr. Hartley deserves to understand the magnitude of what he did." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "I was there. I acted. That's all." "That's not all," Eleanor said quietly. "You've acted twice now, when most men would have walked away. That suggests character. Or stupidity." "Sometimes they look similar," she agreed. "But I don't think you're stupid. Guarded, yes. Closed off, absolutely. But not stupid." Caleb set down his fork. "You don't know anything about me. I know you're alone by choice, not circumstance. I know you've been hurt badly enough that you've bought 300 acres of wilderness to hide in. I know you carry your pain like a weapon to keep people at a distance." She met his eyes without flinching. "Am I wrong?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Dr. Whitman looked between them with growing alarm, clearly wishing he could disappear into the floorboards. "How do you know that?" Caleb finally asked. "Because I recognize the symptoms. I'm a doctor's daughter. I've been reading people's wounds, visible and invisible, since I was 12 years old." She paused. "And because I see some of the same symptoms when I look in the mirror." That stopped him. "You? Why do you think I'm still here? A woman with an Eastern education, nursing and medical training, stuck in a town with 300 people and exactly 0 prospects?" There was no bitterness in her voice, just statement of fact. "I came west with my parents because my father wanted to serve where doctors were scarce. My mother died. I stayed because leaving felt like abandoning her memory. And then staying became habit, and habit became identity. And now I'm the doctor's daughter in Silver Ridge, Montana, and that's all I'll ever be." "Eleanor," her father began. Her father. "It's true, father, and you know it. Every young man in this territory is looking for a wife who will birth children and keep quiet. They want decoration or utility, not partnership. And the older men," she gestured vaguely at the door, implying Deacons and his ilk. "Well, you saw." Caleb didn't know what to say to that. The honesty was disarming, almost aggressive in its vulnerability. "So yes," Eleanor continued, "I understand the impulse to isolate, to build walls, to choose loneliness over the risk of more loss. I just choose to do it in a town rather than on 300 empty acres." "At least on 300 empty acres, no one bothers you," Caleb said. "True. But no one sees you either. After a while, when no one sees you, you start to wonder if you exist at all." The words hit harder than Caleb wanted to admit. He'd spent years perfecting invisibility, and Eleanor had just articulated the cost with surgical precision. Dr. Whitman cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should discuss lighter topics." But the moment had passed, and the conversation that followed, about the weather, the town, the prospects for the coming year, felt hollow after what had been said. They finished the meal with careful courtesy, and when Caleb stood to leave, Eleanor walked him to the door while her father discreetly remained in the kitchen. "Thank you again," she said, "for my father, for earlier with deacons, for everything. You don't owe me anything. I know. That's why I want to give you something anyway." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "It's Thoreau, Walden. You might have read it already, but I haven't. It's about a man who goes into the woods to live deliberately, to find himself in solitude. I thought—" She trailed off, looking almost embarrassed. "I thought you might appreciate it during your isolation." Caleb took the book, feeling its weight in his hand. It was worn, clearly read multiple times. "This is yours?" "Was mine. Now it's yours. Consider it payment for services rendered." "I said I don't want payment." "Then consider it a gift from someone who understands." Her eyes held his. "And perhaps, if the solitude becomes too much, if you find yourself in town for supplies or business, you might stop by. Let me know if Thoreau got it right." It was the smallest of invitations, barely an invitation at all, easily declined or ignored. But standing there on the porch with the evening settling cool around them, Caleb found himself unable to give her the clean refusal she deserved. "Maybe," he heard himself say. Her smile was small, sad, and knowing. "Maybe is better than no. Good luck with your land, Caleb Hartley. I hope you find what you're looking for out there." He nodded, turned, and walked to his horse. As he rode away into the gathering darkness, heading northwest toward the land that was supposed to represent his future, he could feel the book's weight in his saddlebag and Eleanor Whitman's eyes on his back. One dinner, he'd promised himself, but promises, he was beginning to remember, were fragile things on the frontier. And the most dangerous promises were the ones you made to yourself, the ones that pretended you could control what mattered. The ride to his land took 2 days through increasingly wild country. Caleb made camp the first night beside a creek that ran clear and cold from snowmelt, cooked beans over a small fire, and tried not to think about Eleanor's question. When no one sees you, you start to wonder if you exist at all. He existed. He was real, solid, here. But lying under the stars that night, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like pressure, Caleb opened the book she'd given him and read by firelight. "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." He closed the book and stared at the fire for a long time. By the time he reached his land the next afternoon, the sun was westering and the mountains threw long shadows across the valley he now owned. It was beautiful in a harsh, indifferent way, pines climbing the slopes, a stream cutting through the lower acreage, meadows that would support cattle, rock outcroppings that would provide building stone. Empty, silent. Caleb dismounted and stood looking at 300 acres of purchased isolation. This was supposed to be triumph, the culmination of years of planning and sacrifice, the place where he would finally be safe from the world's capacity for taking what he loved. Instead, he felt the weight of that silence pressing down like earth on a coffin. He made camp, built a fire, started planning where he'd place the cabin, where he'd run fence line, how he'd structure the life he intended to live alone. But that night, lying in his bedroll under stars that felt closer than they should, Caleb dreamed of fire and ash, of his mother's hand slipping from his, of Dutch bleeding out in Wyoming dust, of Eleanor Whitman's eyes asking him questions he didn't want to answer. When he woke before dawn, cold and stiff, the first thought that surfaced was, one dinner wasn't enough. And the second thought, more dangerous than the first, what if she was right? What if surviving isn't the same as living? He pushed both thoughts away, got up, and started work on the cabin that would be his fortress, his sanctuary, his carefully constructed exile from the possibility of loss. But even as he worked, swinging an axe to fell timber for walls, Caleb couldn't quite silence the voice in his head, a voice that sounded unsettlingly like Eleanor's, asking whether he was building a home or just a very elaborate grave. The walls went up slowly, one log at a time, and with each log, Caleb told himself he was making the right choice, that solitude was strength, that isolation was wisdom learned from bitter experience. But at night, when he was too tired to maintain his defenses, he'd find himself holding that worn copy of Thoreau, reading passages that felt less like validation and more like challenge, wondering what Eleanor Whitman was doing in Silver Ridge, whether Deacons was still bothering her, whether her father had recovered from the shock of nearly dying, wondering if she wondered about him at all. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he'd made his choice. He told himself a lot of things during those weeks of solitary labor, building his cabin in the wilderness. But late at night, staring at stars through gaps in a roof not yet finished, Caleb Hartley was beginning to suspect that the heart he'd thought was safely dead might still be beating after all. And that terrified him more than any bandit's gun ever could. The cabin took shape over 6 weeks of dawn to dusk labor that left Caleb's hands blistered and his body aching in ways that felt almost cleansing. Physical pain was honest, direct, something that could be managed with rest and determination. It was the other kind of pain, the kind that woke him in the pre-dawn hours with Eleanor Whitman's voice echoing in his skull, that he couldn't seem to work away. By mid-July, the structure was sound enough to keep out rain and wind. The roof needed chinking, the door hung crooked, and the single window he'd managed to install looked out toward the mountains with a view that was either inspiring or oppressive depending on his mood. He'd built a corral for his horse, cleared land for a garden he'd probably never plant, and erected the skeletal framework of what his isolated life would become. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like waiting. The supplies he'd purchased in Silver Ridge were running low, coffee especially, which had become less of a luxury and more of a necessity during the long evenings when sleep wouldn't come. He told himself that was the reason he saddled his horse on a Thursday morning and began the 2-day ride back toward town. Just supplies. Nothing more. The lie tasted bitter, even as he thought it. The journey back felt different than the journey out had been. The landscape that had seemed harsh and purifying 6 weeks ago now felt merely empty. The silence that was supposed to bring peace instead brought a strange restlessness that made Caleb push his horse harder than he should have, cutting the 2-day trip to a day and a half by riding into the night and starting again before dawn. He reached Silver Ridge just after noon on Friday, the main street busier than it had been during his last visit. A freight wagon was being unloaded outside the general store, and a handful of ranch hands were tying up horses outside the saloon. Caleb recognized none of them, which suited him fine. He was hitching his horse outside the general store when he heard her voice. "Mr. Hartley? Is that really you, or am I seeing ghosts?" Eleanor stood in the doorway of her father's office. A basket of laundry balanced on her hip, her expression caught between surprise and something that might have been pleasure. She wore a simple blue dress, faded from washing, and her hair was coming loose from its pins in a way that suggested she'd been working hard all morning. She looked real in a way that made his carefully constructed solitude feel like the ghost. "Miss Whitman?" He touched his hat brim, suddenly aware of how rough he must look after 6 weeks of bachelor living in the wilderness. "Just came in for supplies." "Of course." She set the basket down and walked toward him, her eyes scanning his face with that unsettling directness he remembered. "You look like the wilderness has been treating you well, or at least consistently." "It's been fine." High praise. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "How's the cabin coming?" "Standing, mostly." Also high praise for Montana construction. She glanced past him toward the general store. "Are you staying in town tonight, or heading back immediately?" The question was casual, but Caleb heard the weight beneath it. "Hadn't decided yet." "My father would love to see you. He talks about what you did quite often. I think you've achieved legendary status in his mind, the mysterious stranger who saved his life, and then vanished into the mountains like something from a dime novel." "I'm not mysterious, just private." "There's a difference?" "I think so." Eleanor studied him for a moment, and Caleb had the uncomfortable feeling she was reading volumes in what he wasn't saying. "We're having dinner tonight. Nothing fancy. Father's been tending to Mrs. Henderson's children all week. They've had fever and he's exhausted. But if you wanted to stop by, I don't want to impose." "You wouldn't be. Honestly, I think seeing you would do him good. Give him a chance to thank you properly. now that he's had time to process almost dying. She paused. And I wouldn't mind the company either. It's been a quiet 6 weeks. There it was again. That small invitation that felt enormous, that could be declined without insult, but somehow felt impossible to refuse. Caleb knew he should say no, should get his supplies and leave, ride back to his cabin and his purchased isolation and his safe distance from anything that might matter. What time? He heard himself ask instead. Eleanor's smile widened just slightly. 6 o'clock. And Mr. Hartley? You might want to consider the boarding house for tonight. Mrs. Chen has clean rooms and asks no questions. I imagine sleeping in an actual bed would be a novelty after 6 weeks. I've got a bed in my cabin. Does it have a mattress? It has blankets. That's not the same thing. She picked up her laundry basket. 6 o'clock. Try not to vanish into the mountains before then. She walked back toward the office, and Caleb stood there feeling like he'd just been outmaneuvered by someone who hadn't even been trying. He got his supplies with methodical efficiency: coffee, flour, beans, salt pork, ammunition, lamp oil. The clerk was a different man than before, younger, more talkative, trying to engage Caleb in conversation about the weather and the territorial governor and some dispute about water rights that apparently had the ranchers up in arms. Caleb responded with the minimum number of words required by basic courtesy. With his supplies secured, he had 6 hours to kill before dinner. He could leave, should leave, pack his goods and ride northwest and pretend the invitation had never been extended. Instead, he found himself walking toward the boarding house Eleanor had mentioned. Mrs. Chen was a Chinese woman in her 50s who ran her establishment with quiet efficiency and, as advertised, asked no questions beyond whether he wanted dinner included with the room. He said no to the dinner, paid for one night, and carried his saddlebags upstairs to a room that was small but impeccably clean, with a real bed that had a real mattress and sheets that smelled of lavender. He sat on the edge of that bed and tried to understand what he was doing. 6 weeks ago, he'd left Silver Ridge with a plan: build his cabin, establish his isolated life, avoid any entanglement that might give the world leverage to hurt him again. That plan had been clear, simple, achievable. Now here he was, back in town after barely a month and a half, accepting dinner invitations from a woman whose eyes seemed to see straight through every defense he'd built. It was stupid, dangerous, exactly the kind of thing he'd sworn to avoid. And yet, he lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and let himself remember the sound of Eleanor's voice, the way she'd looked at him, not with pity or judgment, but with understanding, the recognition of one wounded person acknowledging another. Maybe one more dinner wouldn't hurt. Maybe he could allow himself this small thing and then go back to his solitude with his armor intact. Maybe he was lying to himself again. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but his mind wouldn't quiet. Finally, he pulled out the copy of Thoreau that Eleanor had given him and opened it at random. I learned this, at least, by my experiment, that if one advances confidently in the direction of his dreams and endeavors to live the life which he has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. Caleb closed the book with more force than necessary. Thoreau, he decided, was an idealist who'd probably never watched his mother burn to death or held a dying man in his arms. But the words stayed with him anyway. At 5:30, he washed in the basin Mrs. Chen had provided, changed into his least worn shirt, and tried to convince himself this was normal behavior and not the actions of a man whose carefully maintained isolation was developing cracks. At 5:45, he left the boarding house and walked toward the doctor's office, his boots loud on the wooden sidewalk, his heart beating harder than it had any right to during something as simple as a dinner invitation. At 6 o'clock exactly, he knocked on the Whitmans' door. Eleanor opened it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. She'd changed into a different dress, dark green, simple but well-fitted, and done something different with her hair that Caleb couldn't have described but somehow noticed. Her eyes met his with that same directness, but now there was warmth in them too, something that made his carefully prepared defenses feel suddenly inadequate. "You came," she said, and there was genuine pleasure in her voice. "Said I would." "Yes, but saying and doing are different things. I wasn't sure which kind of man you were." "What kind am I?" "The kind who keeps his word, apparently, even when it costs him something." She stepped aside. "Come in." Father's just finishing with some paperwork, but he'll be done soon. The house smelled of cooking, something with herbs and meat that made Caleb realize he'd been living on beans and hardtack for 6 weeks. The kitchen was warm, the lamplight golden against the walls, and there was a comfort to the space that felt both foreign and achingly familiar. "Can I get you coffee?" Eleanor asked. "Or water? We have some whiskey if you'd prefer something stronger." "Coffee's fine." She poured from a pot on the stove and handed him a cup. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, just for a second, and Caleb felt that brief contact like a shock. He pulled back too quickly, and from Eleanor's expression she'd noticed. "You really did isolate yourself completely, didn't you?" she said quietly. 6 weeks with no human contact at all. That was the idea. How did it feel? The question caught him off guard. Not, how was it, but how did it feel? As if she understood the difference between logistics and experience. "Quiet," he said after a moment. "Is that what you wanted?" "It's what I thought I wanted." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if he'd just confirmed something she'd suspected. "And now?" Before Caleb could answer, or more likely deflect, Dr. Whitman emerged from the office, his face lighting up when he saw who was in his kitchen. "Mr. Hartley, Eleanor said you might come, but I hardly dared hope." He crossed the room and shook Caleb's hand with genuine warmth. "You look well. The frontier life suits you." "Thank you, Doctor. Please call me Thomas. Anyone who saves my life twice has earned first-name privileges." He turned to Eleanor. "Did you tell him about deacons?" "Not yet, Father. I thought we could get through basic pleasantries first." "What about deacons?" Caleb asked, attention suddenly coiling in his gut. Thomas's expression darkened. "He and his brother, the one you shot, Vernon, they were part of a larger gang operating out of the territorial prison. When Vernon and young Clem were arrested, it triggered an investigation. Turns out they'd been running a protection racket through half the territory. Sheriff Garrett coordinated with federal marshals, real ones this time, and they've arrested 15 men. The whole operation collapsed." "Because you stopped them," Eleanor added. "Because you intervened." Caleb shook his head. "I just slowed them down." "You did more than that," Thomas insisted. "The marshal who came through told me that your actions likely prevented multiple deaths. These men were escalating, robbery, assault, and worse. You put an end to it. Not intentionally." "Does intention matter if the result saves lives?" Eleanor asked. It was the kind of question she seemed to specialize in, the kind that looked simple but contained depths that could drown you if you weren't careful. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "An honest answer," Eleanor said. "I appreciate that more than false modesty." They sat down to dinner, and the conversation flowed more easily than Caleb expected. Thomas was an educated man, well-read despite his isolation, and he had stories from his years in Boston before coming west that were by turns fascinating and tragic. Eleanor contributed her own observations, and Caleb found himself occasionally offering thoughts on books he'd read, places he'd been, without his usual guardedness. It felt dangerous. It felt good. "So tell us about your land," Thomas said over dessert, apple pie that Eleanor had somehow conjured despite, as far as Caleb could tell, limited resources. "Eleanor says you've built a cabin." "Started one. It's functional, but not finished." "And you planned a ranch?" "Eventually, run some cattle, maybe horses. I've got water and grazing land. It's good country if you don't mind the isolation." "Do you mind it?" Eleanor asked. Caleb met her eyes across the table. "Ask me in a year." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." Thomas glanced between them with growing interest, then manufactured a reason to check on something in his office, leaving them alone with the kind of transparent parenting that made Caleb want to bolt for the door. "My father's subtlety needs work," Eleanor said dryly once he'd gone. "I noticed. He likes you. He thinks you're good for me. He doesn't know me. He knows you saved his life. He knows you're honest. He knows you came back to town despite clearly wanting to avoid human contact." She paused. "He knows more than you think." Caleb stood, suddenly needing to move. "I should go." "Already? You haven't even finished your pie." "It's getting late. It's barely 8 o'clock." Eleanor rose as well, moving to block his path to the door, in a way that wasn't aggressive but was definitely intentional. Why do you do that? Do what? Run. Every time a conversation gets close to something real, you find a reason to leave. I'm not running. What do you call it? Being careful. Of what? Her voice was gentle but relentless. What are you so afraid of, Caleb? The use of his first name hit harder than he expected. He'd been Mr. Hartley all evening, and the switch to intimacy felt like a line being crossed. I'm not afraid. Then why did you buy 300 acres of isolation? Why did you spend 6 weeks alone building a cabin you don't seem to want to live in? Why did you come back to town the moment you had an excuse? I needed supplies. The general store in Helena is bigger and cheaper. You rode past it to get here. She took a step closer. You came back because you wanted to, because 6 weeks of solitude taught you something you didn't want to learn. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. You don't know what I learned. Then tell me. Why? So you can analyze it, add it to your collection of wounded people you've diagnosed? The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he saw Eleanor flinch slightly. But she didn't back down. That's not fair, she said quietly. I'm not trying to fix you. I'm just trying to understand you. Why? Because I recognize something in you, something I see in myself. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Because I've spent 3 years in this town building my own kind of isolation, and I know what it costs. And because when I saw you 6 weeks ago, for the first time in a long time, I felt less alone. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and undefended. Caleb knew he should deflect, should find some way to diminish what she'd just shared, should get out the door and back to his safe distance. Instead, he heard himself say, I lost everyone I ever cared about. My parents, my guardian, everyone. The world taught me that attachment is a weakness and love is just another word for future grief. I know. You can't know. You still have your father. And I live in terror every single day that I'll lose him too, that some illness I can't treat or some accident I can't prevent will take him, and I'll be completely alone in a place that's never felt like home. She crossed her arms, not in defense, but as if holding herself together. So yes, I know what it's like to be afraid of losing what you love. The difference is, I haven't let that fear convince me that never loving is safer. Isn't it? No, it's just lonelier. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to explain that loneliness was a reasonable price for safety, that walls existed for good reasons, that isolation wasn't failure, but strategy. But standing in that warm kitchen with Eleanor Whitman's eyes holding his with unwavering honesty, the arguments felt hollow. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. Do what? Whatever this is. Connection. Trust. Letting someone matter. Neither do I, Eleanor admitted. Not anymore. I've forgotten how to be anything other than the doctor's daughter. The capable one. The one who doesn't need help or companionship or anything that might make me vulnerable. Then we're both broken. We're both scared. She took another step closer, but maybe scared together is better than scared alone. Caleb felt something in his chest crack, not painfully, but like ice breaking under spring warmth. What are you asking me? I'm asking you to consider that maybe your cabin doesn't have to be a fortress, that maybe you could build a life instead of just a hiding place. She paused, seeming to gather courage. I'm asking if you'd consider staying in Silver Ridge a few more days. Get to know the town, get to know me. And if you still want to disappear into your 300 acres after that, at least you'll be making an informed choice. It was a reasonable request. Small, even, and absolutely terrifying. What if I hurt you? Caleb asked quietly. What if you don't? What if you hurt me? Then we'll both have learned we're still capable of feeling something real. Eleanor reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and touched his hand. Her palm was warm, calloused from work, solid, real. I'm not asking for promises, Caleb. I'm not asking you to stay forever. I'm just asking for a few days, a chance. Caleb looked down at their hands, his larger and rougher, hers small but strong. He thought about his cabin in the wilderness, waiting empty and cold. He thought about 6 weeks of silence that had felt less like peace and more like suffocation. He thought about Eleanor's question, When no one sees you, you start to wonder if you exist at all. He thought about fire and ash and loss and all the reasons he'd built his walls. And then he thought about sitting at this kitchen table, eating pie, talking about books, and feeling something dangerously close to belonging. 3 days, he said. Eleanor's smile was small, but genuine. 3 days is a start. She squeezed his hand once, then let go, and the absence of her touch felt like a cold wind. Thomas returned from his office with theatrical timing, pretending he hadn't been listening from the next room, and insisted Caleb have another piece of pie. They talked until nearly 10 o'clock, about medicine and ranching and the territorial politics that were slowly dragging Montana toward statehood. Caleb found himself relaxing in increments, the armor he'd maintained for so long getting heavier and harder to hold up. When he finally left, Eleanor walked him to the door while Thomas discreetly cleaned the kitchen. "Thank you for staying," she said. "Thank you for convincing me to. Will you come by tomorrow? Father makes rounds in the morning, but I'll be here. I could show you around town properly, introduce you to people." The idea of being introduced to people, of being seen and known and recorded in the collective memory of a community, should have felt like a threat. Instead, it just felt like possibility. "All right," Caleb said. 10 o'clock? I'll be here." He walked back to the boarding house through streets that were mostly dark, a few lit windows showing where people were finishing evening chores or settling children into bed. Normal life, the kind he'd convinced himself he didn't want or need. In his room, he lay on the real mattress with real sheets and stared at the ceiling, his mind churning. 3 days. He'd agreed to 3 days. It didn't mean anything. It was just time. He could spend 3 days in Silver Ridge, satisfy whatever obligation Eleanor thought he owed, and then return to his cabin with his isolation intact. Except he'd seen how Eleanor looked at him, not with pity or desire or any of the simple emotions he could have deflected. She looked at him with recognition, with understanding, like she saw the man beneath the armor and wasn't afraid of what she found there. And the terrifying part was, he was beginning to realize he wanted to be seen. Sleep came slowly, troubled by dreams of fire that morphed into warm kitchens, of walls crumbling into doorways, of isolation transforming into something that looked dangerously like home. The next morning, Caleb woke early and found himself actually caring what he looked like. He washed carefully, shaved for the first time in 6 weeks, and changed into his cleanest shirt with a self-consciousness that would have been embarrassing if anyone else had witnessed it. At 9:30, he left the boarding house and walked toward the doctor's office, his stomach tight with nerves that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the woman who was waiting for him. Eleanor greeted him at the door wearing a practical dress and a wide-brimmed hat against the morning sun. "You're early," she observed. "Didn't want to be late." "How responsible of you." Her eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement. "Ready for the grand tour of Silver Ridge? It'll take about 20 minutes to see everything, so try to contain your excitement." They walked the main street together, Eleanor pointing out the various establishments with commentary that was both informative and gently mocking. The saloon that leaned left, I give it 3 more years before it just lies down completely. The church that leaned right, theological balance, perhaps. The general store where dreams go to buy flour. The blacksmith's forge. Mr. Johansson, cranky but competent. The schoolhouse, empty in summer, chaotic the rest of the year. People watched them as they passed. Some called out greetings to Eleanor, their eyes sliding to Caleb with open curiosity. He felt exposed in a way that should have been uncomfortable but somehow wasn't, because Eleanor handled it with easy deflection. "That's Mr. Hartley, yes. He helped my father some weeks back. No, he's not looking for a wife, Mrs. Patterson, so you can stop calculating. Yes, Sheriff, he's the one who brought in the Deacon's gang. No, Mr. Foster, he's not interested in your investment opportunity." "How did you know I wasn't interested?" Caleb asked after they'd passed the ambitious Mr. Foster. "Because you're not interested in anything that ties you down." She glanced at him sideways. "Although you're here, so maybe I'm wrong about that." They reached the edge of town where the road forked. One path leading northwest toward his land, the other heading southeast toward ranches, and eventually Helena. "This is where Silver Ridge ends and the frontier begins again," Eleanor said. Not much to look at, is it? It's honest. Is that a compliment? In my experience, honesty is rare enough to count as one. Eleanor turned to face him, her expression serious. Then I'll be honest with you. This town needs people like you, people who have the courage to act when others freeze, people who don't run from trouble. I ran from everything for years. Running toward something isn't the same as running away. You ran toward isolation because you thought it would protect you, but you came back because somewhere inside you know walls don't keep you safe. They just keep you lonely. You're very determined to save me, aren't you? I'm not trying to save you. I'm trying to give you permission to save yourself. She paused. And maybe I'm hoping that in the process, you'll show me how to do the same. Before Caleb could respond, a commotion erupted from the center of town. Shouting, the sound of horses, someone calling for the doctor. They ran. A wagon had overturned near the mercantile, pinning a man beneath it while 3 others struggled to lift the weight. Thomas Whitman was already there, medical bag in hand, shouting instructions. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed one side of the wagon, adding his strength to the others, and on the count of 3 they heaved. The wagon shifted, tilted, came up just enough for Thomas to pull the injured man clear. The man was alive but hurt, ribs at minimum, possibly internal injuries. Thomas worked with swift efficiency while Eleanor appeared with clean cloths and water, the 2 of them moving in practice synchronization. Caleb and the others righted the wagon fully, checked the horses for injury, cleared debris from the street. It was done in minutes. The emergency transformed into aftermath. The town's collective breath returning to normal rhythm. Thomas looked up from his patient. We need to get him to the office. Caleb, can you help carry? They moved the injured man carefully, a rancher named Sullivan who'd apparently hit a rut at the wrong angle and lost control of his load. In the office, Thomas worked while Eleanor assisted, and Caleb stood uselessly in the corner, feeling like he should leave but somehow unable to. An hour later, Sullivan was stable, sedated, sleeping while his body began the work of healing. Thomas washed his hands with thoroughness born of long practice. You were there fast, he said to Caleb, and you knew exactly what to do. Just helped lift a wagon. You helped save a man's life. Again. Thomas dried his hands, his expression thoughtful. You know, this town could use a deputy. Sheriff Garrett mentioned it just last week. Said he's getting too old to handle things alone, and the territory won't fund a second full-time position. But a deputy marshal, volunteer position with small stipend that he could arrange. I'm not a lawman. You're someone who acts when action is needed. That's all a deputy needs to be. I have land, a cabin, 20 miles away. You could work 1 week out of the month, help keep order, make a little money to supplement ranching. Thomas met his eyes. And you'd have a reason to come to town regularly, to be part of a community. Caleb felt the trap closing, gently, almost invisibly, but closing nonetheless. I'll think about it. That's all I ask. Eleanor walked Caleb out while Thomas stayed with his patient. On the porch, she stopped and turned to him. He's right, you know. You'd be good at it. Or I'd get someone killed. You haven't yet. There's always a first time. There's always a first time for everything. First time you save a life. First time you let yourself be part of something. First time you stop running. She reached out and touched his arm, just briefly. You don't have to decide today. You have 2 more days of your 3-day trial. Use them. Caleb looked at her hand on his arm, at her face in the morning light, at the town stretching behind her with all its messy, complicated humanity. What if I'm not who you think I am? He asked quietly. What if you're exactly who I think you are, and that's what scares you? She was too perceptive, too willing to ask the questions that had no easy answers, too determined to see through walls that had taken him years to build. And standing there on that porch, with the sound of the town around them and the mountains rising in the distance, Caleb realized something that felt like vertigo. He didn't want her to stop looking. 2 more days, he said. Eleanor smiled. 2 more days. Those 2 days stretched into something Caleb hadn't experienced since childhood. Time that felt full instead of empty. Hours that passed without the weight of isolation pressing down on his chest. He helped Sheriff Garrett with minor tasks around town, learning the rhythm of a lawman's work without committing to the badge. He took meals with the Whitmans, conversations flowing easier each time, Eleanor's questions becoming less like interrogations and more like invitations to be known. On the third evening, sitting on the Whitman's porch as the sun dropped behind the mountains, Eleanor turned to him with an expression that was equal parts hope and resignation. "Your 3 days are up," she said quietly. Caleb had been dreading this moment since he'd agreed to it. The part where he had to choose, the part where staying meant admitting he'd been wrong about needing isolation, and leaving meant proving he was exactly the coward his walls suggested. "They are," he acknowledged. "And?" Thomas had diplomatically found reasons to be inside, leaving them alone with the question hanging between them like smoke. "I should go back to my cabin," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash. "I've got work waiting, fences to build, stock to acquire." Eleanor nodded, her face carefully neutral. "Of course. That was always the plan. But I could come back, once a month maybe. Help the sheriff like your father suggested. Check in." "Check in." Eleanor's voice was flat, like a circuit judge or a traveling merchant. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to say what you actually feel instead of what you think keeps you safe." She stood, facing him directly. "These 3 days weren't about the town, Caleb. They were about us. About whether you could let yourself be close to someone without running, and you lasted 72 hours before finding an excuse to leave. It's not an excuse. I have land, a cabin. That's real. So is this." She gestured between them. "What we've been building here, the conversations, the dinners, the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, that's real too. But it requires something your cabin doesn't." "What's that?" "Risk. The risk that I might matter, that you might matter to me, that something could grow here that would hurt like hell if you lost it." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "You knew what I was when we started this." "I knew what you pretended to be. I was hoping to find out who you actually are." Eleanor's eyes were bright, not with tears, but with frustration. "But maybe I was wrong. Maybe the walls are all there is." "That's not fair." "Life isn't fair, Caleb. You of all people should know that, but we still have to choose how we live in it. We can hide from pain, or we can decide that connection is worth the risk. You're choosing to hide." "I'm choosing to survive." "No, you survived years ago. Now you're just choosing not to live." The words hit like a physical blow. Caleb stood, needing distance, needing air, needing anything but the truth Eleanor was forcing him to face. "I should go," he said. "Yes, you should. That's what you do best." Eleanor's voice cracked slightly. "Just promise me one thing." "What?" "When you're out there alone in your cabin, when the silence gets so loud you can't think, ask yourself if you're really safer or just more lonely. And be honest about the answer." Caleb wanted to argue, to defend his choices, to explain that isolation wasn't failure, but wisdom learned from brutal experience. Instead, he just nodded, touched his hat brim, and walked away into the gathering darkness. He collected his things from the boarding house, settled his account with Mrs. Chen, and was saddling his horse outside the stable when Sheriff Garrett appeared out of the shadows. "Heard you're leaving," the older man said, leaning against the stable wall. "Word travels fast." "Small town, everything travels fast." Garrett pulled out a pipe, began packing it with tobacco. "You know, I've been sheriff here for 12 years, seen a lot of men come through, most of them running from something or toward something, rarely both at the same time. I'm not running." "Didn't say you were. Said most men are." He lit the pipe, the match flare illuminating his weathered face. "But you're different. You're running from ghosts. Problem with ghosts is they follow. Distance doesn't matter to them." "I'm just going back to my land." "Your land, right." Garrett puffed thoughtfully. "Let me tell you something about isolation, son. I tried it once, after my wife died. Built myself a line shack up in the hills, figured I'd live out my days alone. Lasted 3 months before I realized I wasn't honoring her memory. I was dishonoring her life. She'd have hated seeing me waste what she couldn't have anymore. This is different." "Is it?" "Eleanor Whitman is the finest woman in this territory. Smart, capable, sees the world clear. And she sees something in you worth fighting for. Most men would consider that a gift. You're treating it like a curse." Caleb finished tightening the saddle straps, his movements sharp with frustration. You don't know what you're talking about. Maybe not, but I know what regret looks like. And I know that 20 years from now, when you're alone in that cabin, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember walking away from a woman who saw you, really saw you, and decided you were worth the trouble anyway. Garrett paused. Just make sure it's the memory you want to carry. He walked away before Caleb could respond, leaving him alone with his horse and his choices and the weight of words he didn't want to hear. Caleb rode out of Silver Ridge just after 10 o'clock, the moon bright enough to make the trail visible. He pushed hard, covering ground with a speed that was part efficiency and part escape. By dawn, he was halfway to his cabin, and by noon the next day, he was standing in front of the structure he'd built with his own hands, looking at walls that suddenly seemed less like protection and more like a prison. The cabin was exactly as he'd left it, cold, empty, silent, perfect. He unpacked, started a fire, made coffee, went through all the routines of solitary life with mechanical efficiency. This was what he wanted, what he'd planned, what made sense. But that night, lying in his blanket-covered bed, staring at the rough ceiling he'd constructed log by log, all Caleb could hear was Eleanor's voice asking if he was really safer or just more lonely. He spent the next week throwing himself into work. He built fences that didn't strictly need building. He cleared land he had no immediate plans to use. He repaired things that weren't broken. Physical labor was supposed to quiet the mind, to exhaust the body into a dreamless sleep. Instead, he found himself replaying conversations. The way Eleanor laughed when he said something unexpectedly dry. The way Thomas told stories with his hands. The easy comfort of sitting in a warm kitchen while rain pattered on the roof outside. The way Eleanor had looked at him on that porch, asking him to choose risk over safety, connection over isolation. He'd chosen wrong. He knew it with a certainty that felt like nausea. But going back would mean admitting it, would mean exposing himself to exactly the kind of pain he'd spent years avoiding, would mean surrendering walls that had kept him functional, if not happy. So he stayed, and the cabin felt emptier each day. 2 weeks after leaving Silver Ridge, Caleb was repairing a section of corral fence when he saw the rider approaching from the southeast. Just one man, moving at a steady pace, no urgency but no hesitation either. Something in Caleb's gut tightened. Years of frontier living had honed his instincts, and those instincts were screaming that this wasn't a social call. He set down his tools, walked to the cabin, and retrieved his rifle. Then he stood on his porch and waited as the rider drew closer, close enough to make out details. 30s, hard-faced, wearing a gun low on his hip in a way that suggested familiarity. Not a rancher, not a merchant, something else. The rider stopped 20 yards out, studying Caleb with eyes that calculated angles and odds. "You Caleb Hartley?" the man called out. "Depends who's asking." "Name's Garrett. No relation to your sheriff friend. I'm looking for the man who shot my brothers." The bottom dropped out of Caleb's stomach. Deacons. Of course it was about the Deacons gang. He'd been naive to think that arresting Vernon and Clem would be the end of it. "Your brothers tried to rob and kill a doctor," Caleb said evenly. "They made their choices. And you made yours. Shot Clem in the shoulder, killed Vernon in custody when he tried to escape." The man's voice was flat, factual. "They were blood. That means something to me. Vernon died in custody? I didn't. Don't matter if you pulled the trigger directly. You started the chain, and now I'm here to finish it." Caleb's mind raced. This man hadn't drawn his gun yet, which meant he wanted something more than a straight kill. Information, maybe. Or a message to send. "You came alone?" Caleb asked. "Didn't need company. You're one man in the middle of nowhere. Figure I can handle that." It was a mistake, arrogance born of confidence. But Caleb didn't feel relief. He felt only the cold certainty that violence was coming, and with it, the potential to hurt people he'd been trying to protect by staying away. "If you're here for revenge, take it," Caleb said quietly. "But leave Silver Ridge out of it. Leave the doctor and his daughter alone. This is between us." Garrett smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Caleb had seen in months. "See, that's where you're wrong. I did my research before riding out here, talked to folks in town. Heard all about how you've been sniffing around the doctor's daughter, how she looks at you, how her daddy thinks you hung the moon. They're not part of this. They're exactly part of this. Because killing you quick would be easy. But making you watch while I take what matters to you, that's the revenge Vernon would have wanted. He always said pain is better than death. Caleb felt ice flood his veins. You touch them, I'll hunt you to the ends of the earth. You'll be dead. Can't hunt nobody when you're dead. Garrett's hand drifted toward his gun. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to ride back to Silver Ridge with me, nice and peaceful. And when we get there, you're going to watch while I settle accounts. Then I'll kill you, in that order. And if I refuse? Then I kill you now and ride to Silver Ridge anyway. Your choice, but either way, I'm getting what I came for. Caleb's mind calculated frantically. He could try to shoot Garrett now, had the rifle, had the range. But if he missed or only wounded, if Garrett got away, Eleanor and Thomas would never see him coming. And even if Caleb won this fight, were there others? The Deacon's gang had been 15 men strong. How many were left? How many wanted revenge? He needed information, needed time. How do I know you won't just kill them anyway? Caleb asked. Don't guess you do. But I'm a man of my word, and my word is you get to watch first. That's the deal. It wasn't a deal. It was a trap. But it was a trap that kept Eleanor and Thomas alive for the next few hours, which meant it was a trap worth considering. Let me get my horse, Caleb said. Leave the rifle. Caleb leaned the rifle against the porch rail, every movement careful and visible. He walked to the corral, saddled his horse with Garrett watching every move, and mounted up with his hands deliberately away from his colt. They rode southeast together, Garrett keeping a careful distance, close enough to shoot if Caleb tried anything, far enough to react if Caleb got stupid. The miles passed in tense silence, and with each mile, Caleb's mind churned through options and discarded them one by one. He could try to escape, but Garrett would just go to Silver Ridge alone. He could try to fight, but the odds weren't good in open country. He could try to warn the town, but how? They were hours away, and Garrett would never let him get close enough to shout an alarm. The only real option was to get to Silver Ridge, hope for an opportunity to act, and pray he could keep Eleanor and Thomas safe when the violence came. It was a terrible plan. It was the only plan he had. They reached Silver Ridge just before sunset, the town settling into evening routines. Garrett kept his gun hidden but present, close enough to Caleb's back that any sudden move would be fatal. Where's the doctor's house? Garrett asked quietly. North end of town, near the office. We're going to walk there nice and calm. You try to warn anyone, I start shooting. Not you first, them. The women, the kids, whoever's closest. Then the doctor's daughter, then you. Understand? Caleb understood. Understood he'd miscalculated badly. Understood that isolation hadn't protected Eleanor. It had left her vulnerable while he'd been hiding 20 miles away. Understood that if he didn't find a way to stop this, everything Eleanor had said about him would be proven right in the worst possible way. They dismounted near the stable. Garrett's hand never left his gun. They walked up the main street together, two men who might have been friends or business partners, nothing to draw attention. Except Sheriff Garrett, the real Garrett, was standing outside his office, and his lawman's eyes caught something wrong in the picture. He started toward them, hand drifting toward his gun. Evening, Caleb, the sheriff called. Didn't expect you back so soon. Who's your friend? Nobody, Caleb said, putting weight on the word. Just passing through. But the sheriff had been reading men for 12 years. He saw the tension in Caleb's shoulders, the careful distance between the two men, the wrongness of the whole situation. That's so. Sheriff Garrett's hand settled on his gun. Seems like... The other Garrett drew and fired in one smooth motion. The sheriff went down, clutching his shoulder, and suddenly the street was chaos. People screaming, running, diving for cover. Caleb moved on instinct. He grabbed for his own gun, but the outlaw Garrett was already swinging toward him, and Caleb knew with cold certainty that he was too slow, that he'd miscalculated, that Eleanor was about to lose her father because Caleb had been too broken to stay. Then a rifle cracked from the direction of the doctor's office. Garrett staggered, a bloom of red spreading across his chest. He looked down at the wound with something like surprise, then up at the source of the shot. Eleanor stood on her porch, her father's hunting rifle in her hands, her face pale, but her grip steady. She'd just saved Caleb's life. Garrett tried to raise his gun, tried to make good on his threats, but his strength was failing. Caleb drew and fired, catching the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The outlaw Garrett went down hard, his gun skittering across the dirt. The street went silent except for the sheriff's labored breathing. Caleb ran to the wounded lawman while Eleanor and Thomas rushed from their office with medical supplies. The shoulder wound was serious but not fatal. Sheriff Garrett would live if they worked fast. Thomas went to work with practiced efficiency while Eleanor stood guard, her rifle still ready, her eyes scanning for more threats. Only when Thomas said, "I've got him," did she lower the weapon and turn to Caleb. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady given she'd just shot a man. "No, you." "Fine." She looked at the outlaw Garrett, bleeding in the street, and something flickered across her face, not regret exactly, but acknowledgement of a line crossed. "Is he the only one?" "I don't know." Caleb moved to the wounded outlaw, pressed his boot on the man's gun hand. "Talk. How many others?" Garrett coughed blood. "Just me. Wanted. Personal." "You're lying." "No. Check. My saddlebag. Letter. From Clem. In prison. Said you killed Vernon. Said the doctor. Mattered to you? Wanted revenge." Thomas appeared, having stabilized the sheriff enough to turn his attention to the other patient. "We need to move him inside. He's dying." "Let him," someone in the gathering crowd spat. But Thomas shook his head. "That's not who we are. Help me carry him." They got both wounded men into the doctor's office, laying them on separate tables in a scene that would have been darkly comical if it weren't so grim. The sheriff who'd tried to help, and the outlaw who'd come for revenge, both bleeding, both depending on the same doctor for survival. Thomas worked through the night while Eleanor and Caleb assisted, coffee appearing at regular intervals courtesy of half the town who'd gathered outside offering help. The sheriff would live. The outlaw Garrett would too, though he'd hang for attempted murder of a lawman and whatever other charges the territorial court decided to add. As dawn broke through the office windows, Thomas finally straightened from his work, exhausted but satisfied. "They'll both make it," he announced. The small crowd outside cheered quietly, Silver Ridge taking care of its own. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, needing air, needing space to process what had almost happened. Eleanor followed, and for a long moment they stood in silence watching the town wake up. "You came back," she finally said. "Didn't have much choice. He was going to come whether I cooperated or not. You could have fought him at your cabin. Instead, you rode here with a gun at your back. Why?" "Because he threatened you. And your father. And I couldn't—" Caleb's voice caught. "I couldn't let him hurt you because of me." Eleanor turned to face him fully, and in the morning light, her eyes were the color of silver rivers. "You were willing to die, to be forced to watch us die, all because you tried to protect us by staying away." "I know. I'm sorry. You should never have left." Her voice was firm. "That's the lesson here, Caleb. Isolation didn't protect us. It made us vulnerable. You weren't there when danger came. If Sheriff Garrett hadn't noticed something wrong, if I hadn't heard the shot and grabbed a rifle, how would this have ended?" Caleb felt the words like a knife. "I know." "Do you? Because you've spent years believing that not loving people keeps them safe. But it doesn't. It just means you're not there when they need you. I was trying. I know what you were trying to do, but good intentions don't stop bullets. Being present does. Caring enough to stand beside someone does." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I shot a man last night. Killed him, probably, if Father can't work another miracle. I've never hurt anyone in my life, but I did it without hesitation because he was going to hurt you. Eleanor, let me finish. I didn't do it because I'm brave. I did it because you matter. Because 3 days of dinners and conversations and watching you slowly let your walls down was enough to make me willing to become someone I never wanted to be. That's what connection does. It makes you brave and terrified in equal measure." Caleb wanted to argue, to maintain some scrap of the philosophy that had guided him for years, but standing there watching Eleanor, who'd saved his life, who'd crossed her own lines to protect him, who was looking at him with exhaustion and honesty and something that might have been love, he couldn't find the words. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, How to let you matter without being terrified I'll lose you. You're already terrified. You rode into town with a gun at your back rather than let him come here alone. That's not someone who doesn't care. That's someone who cares so much he'll die for it, but won't admit he's living for it. What if I'm not strong enough? Strong enough for what? To love someone? To let someone love you back? Eleanor stepped closer. Caleb, you fought off bandits, you shot outlaws, you built a cabin with your bare hands, you rode into town knowing you'd probably die just to buy us a few more hours of safety. You're strong enough. You're just not ready to believe it. What if you're wrong about me? What if I'm right? The question hung between them as the town stirred to life around them. People were emerging from houses, opening shops, beginning the ordinary routines of another day on the frontier. Sheriff Garrett was being tended by capable hands. The outlaw who'd come for revenge was neutralized. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger crisis, the one that lived in Caleb's chest, the one Eleanor had been trying to resolve since the day they met, that crisis was still unfolding. Thomas appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands. Both patients are stable. The sheriff's asking for you, Caleb. Says he needs to discuss security. Caleb nodded, but didn't move. He was looking at Eleanor, at the woman who'd seen through his walls from the beginning, who challenged him and pushed him and refused to let him hide. The woman who'd killed to protect him, who was asking him again to choose. I don't have an answer yet, he told her quietly, about staying, about us, about any of this. I know, but you have a question now. That's progress. Eleanor smiled tiredly. Go talk to the sheriff. We'll figure out the rest later. We have time. Did they? Caleb wasn't sure, but as he walked into the doctor's office to face the practical questions of law and security, he found himself hoping she was right, because for the first time in 15 years, Caleb Hartley was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, surviving wasn't enough. Maybe it was time to learn how to live. Sheriff Garrett looked worse in daylight than he had in the chaos of the previous night. His face was gray with pain despite the laudanum Thomas had administered, and his shoulder was wrapped in enough bandages to stock a small hospital. But his eyes were sharp when Caleb entered the room. Sit, the sheriff said, gesturing to a chair with his good arm. We need to talk about what happens next. Caleb sat, aware of Thomas working quietly in the corner and Eleanor visible through the doorway, cleaning instruments with mechanical precision. The outlaw Garrett was unconscious in the other room, guarded by two townsmen with rifles who looked like they hoped he'd wake up and try something. The territorial marshal will be here in 3 days, Sheriff Garrett continued. Maybe 4 if the weather turns. He'll want statements from everyone. He'll also want to know why a member of the Deacons gang rode 20 miles to kill a civilian. Because I shot his brothers. You shot 2 criminals in the act of committing crimes. That's not murder. That's justice. The sheriff shifted, wincing. But it tells me something important. It tells me these men have long memories and longer reach than we thought, which means this might not be over. Caleb felt cold settle in his gut. You think there are more? I think Clem Deacons is sitting in a territorial prison with nothing but time and rage. I think he has friends, maybe family, who believe blood demands blood. And I think you painted a target on yourself and everyone you care about the moment you intervened. Then I should leave. Go back to my cabin, let things settle. That's the worst thing you could do. Sheriff Garrett's voice was firm, despite his pain. You leave, and they'll come here anyway, looking for leverage. Dr. Whitman, his daughter. They're known associates now. Leaving doesn't protect them. It just means you won't be here when trouble comes. The same thing Eleanor had said, but hearing it from the sheriff carried different weight. This was professional assessment, not emotional appeal. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you stay. Take that deputy position I offered. Help me keep this town safe while I'm healing. And more than that, be visible. Let whoever's watching know that Silver Ridge isn't easy prey, that we've got a man who can shoot straight and won't back down. That's using me as bait. That's using you as deterrent. There's a difference. The sheriff's expression softened slightly. Look, son, I've been doing this work long enough to read situations. That man who came for you last night, he did his research, knew about the doctor's daughter, knew she mattered to you, planned to use her as leverage. That means someone's been watching. Someone in town talked, deliberately or not, and that someone might talk again. You're saying there's an informant. I'm saying information flows in ways we can't always control. Could be innocent, someone in a saloon mentioning the stranger who shot the Deacon's boys. Could be deliberate, someone with connections to the gang. Either way, the cat's out of the bag. The only question is whether you're here to handle what comes next, or whether you're going to run and hope it doesn't find you. Caleb looked through the doorway at Eleanor, who'd stopped pretending not to listen and was now openly watching the conversation. Her face was unreadable, but her hands were still, waiting. "Give me time to think," Caleb said. "Time's not always a luxury we get, but I'll give you until tomorrow." Sheriff Garrett closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking determination. "Just remember, sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing down outlaws. It's facing down your own fear and deciding to stay anyway." Caleb left the office as Thomas moved to check on his patient. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, Silver Ridge going about its business with the resilience frontier towns developed. Yesterday's violence already becoming yesterday's news, today's chores taking precedence. Eleanor caught up with him halfway down the street. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To think." "Can I come with you?" Caleb wanted to say no, wanted the space to wrestle with this decision alone. But he'd been alone for years, and it had solved exactly nothing. "All right," he said. They walked to the edge of town, to the spot where the road forked and civilization gave way to wilderness. The same spot they'd stood during his 3-day trial, back when he'd thought time alone would provide answers instead of just more questions. "The sheriff's right, isn't he?" Eleanor said after a long silence. "About leaving making things worse. Probably. But you're still considering it. Old habits." "Running isn't a habit, Caleb. It's a choice. And you keep choosing it even when evidence says it doesn't work." She turned to face him. "What would it take? For you to stay? What would make the risk worth it?" "I don't know if anything can." "That's not true. You rode back into town with a gun at your back. You were willing to die to protect us. That's not someone who thinks nothing's worth the risk. That's someone who's already decided what matters but won't admit it." Caleb kicked at a stone, watching it skitter down the road. "Every person I ever loved died. My parents, Dutch, everyone. The lesson couldn't be clearer. The lesson you took is that love equals loss. But that's not the only lesson available." Eleanor's voice was gentle but relentless. "You could learn that love equals meaning, that connection equals purpose, that the time you have with people, however long or short, is what makes life worth living. That's naive." "No, it's hopeful. There's a difference." She paused. "My mother died 3 years ago. Horrible death. Slow, painful. Nothing father could do to stop it. I watched her deteriorate for 6 months, watched her go from a vibrant woman to someone who couldn't recognize her own daughter toward the end. I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry, listen. Because here's what I learned watching her die. She never once regretted loving us. Even in her worst pain, even when she was so far gone she couldn't remember our names, she'd look at father and me and smile. Like somewhere deep down, she still knew we mattered, that she'd chosen right." "But you lost her." "Yes. And it hurt more than anything I'd ever experienced. Still hurts. But you know what would hurt more? If she'd decided we weren't worth the risk. If she'd isolated herself to avoid the possibility of loss. Then I wouldn't just have grief. I'd have emptiness. No memories, no love, no proof that I mattered to anyone." Caleb felt something crack in his chest. That same break he'd felt on the Whitman's porch weeks ago, only deeper now. More fundamental. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive losing again," he admitted. "You're strong enough. You've survived it multiple times. The question isn't whether you can survive loss. You've already proven you can. The question is whether you're brave enough to risk it again for the chance to live instead of just exist. And if I'm not?" Eleanor reached out and took his hand, and the contact felt like an anchor in stormy water. "Then I'll be disappointed, but I'll understand. Trauma doesn't heal on anyone else's timeline." She squeezed his fingers. "But I want you to know something before you decide. Whatever you choose, you've already changed me. These past weeks, even the parts where you were running, they've shown me it's possible to connect with someone again, to feel seen, to hope for something more than just duty and routine. Eleanor, I'm not trying to manipulate you. I'm just being honest. Whether you stay or go, you've already mattered. You can't take that back. So the only question left is whether you want to see what else could grow here, or whether you want to lock it in memory and walk away. Caleb stood there holding her hand, looking at the fork in the road, understanding that this was the real choice. Not town versus cabin, not safety versus risk, but existence versus life. Survival versus living. I need to see something, he said abruptly. What? My cabin. I need to see it one more time before I can decide. Eleanor's face fell slightly, but she nodded. When will you leave? Now. I can be there by nightfall, back by tomorrow afternoon. Will you tell the sheriff? I will, but Caleb... She held his hand tighter. Come back, please. Whatever you decide, come back and tell me to my face. Don't just disappear. I won't disappear. Promise me. The word hung between them, weighted with all the promises he'd broken to himself over the years, all the commitments he'd avoided, all the connections he'd severed. I promise, he said. She released his hand and the absence felt like cold wind. Caleb walked back to town, gathered minimal supplies, and was riding northwest within the hour. The journey that had taken 2 days on his first trip took less than 8 hours this time, pushing his horse hard, eating up miles with an urgency that surprised him. He reached his cabin as the sun touched the mountains, painting everything gold and shadow. The structure he'd built stood solid against the wilderness, logs chinked tight, roof sound, door straight on its hinges after he'd fixed it. It was good work, honest work, empty work. Caleb dismounted and walked through the cabin slowly, seeing it differently now. The single room that had felt like sanctuary now felt like a cell. The bed he'd built felt like a place to wait for death, not rest after living. The stove, the table, the shelf for his few books. All of it suddenly seemed less like a home and more like a monument to fear. This was what safety looked like. Cold. Quiet. Alone. He thought about Eleanor's mother smiling even as she died, still recognizing love beneath the fog of pain. He thought about Sheriff Garrett's words about regret. He thought about Thomas Whitman, who'd come west to serve people, who'd lost his wife but stayed anyway because the work mattered, because the connections mattered. He thought about Eleanor asking him to choose. Caleb sat on his porch as darkness fell, watching stars emerge with a clarity only wilderness provided. This was supposed to be his answer, 300 acres of purchased peace, far from the possibility of loss. Instead, it felt like the loneliest place in the world. Morning came cold and clear, and with it, a certainty Caleb hadn't felt in years. He packed carefully, not everything, but essentials, clothes, books, his father's pocket watch that had survived the fire. Things that mattered. Then he walked around the cabin one more time, saying goodbye to the dream it represented. He wasn't abandoning it entirely. The land was still his, the cabin still sound. He might come here sometimes when he needed space or silence, but it wouldn't be his whole life anymore. It couldn't be. Because Eleanor was right, surviving wasn't enough. He was saddling his horse when he saw the smoke. At first he thought it was morning mist burning off, but the color was wrong, too dark, too thick, and it was coming from the wrong direction. Not from his land, but from the southeast, from the direction of Silver Ridge. Caleb's blood went cold. He mounted and rode hard, pushing his horse to the edge of safety, covering the 20 miles in under 4 hours. Long before he reached town, he could smell it. Wood smoke and something chemical, acrid and wrong. He came over the final rise and saw Silver Ridge burning. Not the whole town, but a significant portion. The doctor's office was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the sky, and fire was spreading to adjacent structures. People swarmed like ants, forming bucket brigades, shouting directions, organized chaos trying to contain disaster. Caleb rode straight in, dismounted before his horse fully stopped, grabbed the first person he saw. "The doctor! Oh, Eleanor! Where are they?" The man, one of the ranch hands he vaguely recognized, pointed toward the church. "Doctor's there with patients. But his daughter, someone said she went back inside for medical supplies before the fire spread." Caleb's vision narrowed to a tunnel. The office was an inferno, the roof already caving, black smoke pouring from windows. No one could be alive in there. No one could survive that. But Eleanor had gone in anyway. He ran toward the burning building, ignoring shouts telling him to stop, ignoring the heat that hit like a physical wall, ignoring every survival instinct that screamed this was suicide. The front door was blocked by fallen timber. Caleb went around back, found a window not yet fully involved, smashed it with his elbow, and dove through. The interior was hell. Smoke so thick he couldn't see 3 feet. Heat that blistered exposed skin, the roar of flames drowning out thought. He dropped low where the air was marginally better, covering his mouth with his bandana, and crawled forward. "Eleanor!" His voice was lost in the inferno's sound. A crash behind him, part of the roof giving way, sending sparks and burning debris everywhere. The way he'd come in was gone. There was no going back now, only forward or death. He found her in what had been Thomas's examination room, unconscious near an overturned cabinet, a medical bag clutched in her arms. Smoke inhalation, probably, or a blow to the head from falling debris. Alive or dead, he couldn't tell. Caleb grabbed her, slung her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, and looked for escape. The main room was fully involved now, flames consuming everything. The window he'd entered through was blocked. The doors were death traps. But there was a back door, barely visible through smoke, partially blocked, but maybe, still passable. He lurched toward it, legs burning, lungs screaming for air that wasn't there, Eleanor's weight both precious and crushing. The door was jammed, swollen or blocked, and Caleb hit it with his shoulder once, twice, 3 times, each impact sending agony through his body. It gave. They fell through into blessed air, into hands that grabbed them both, into voices shouting for the doctor, into light that hurt his eyes after the darkness of smoke. Someone was pouring water over him. Someone else was taking Eleanor, laying her on the ground, checking for breathing. Caleb tried to get up, tried to see if she was alive, but his legs wouldn't support him. Thomas appeared, his face streaked with soot and tears, dropping to his knees beside his daughter. "She's breathing," someone said. "Weak, but breathing." Thomas worked with shaking hands, clearing her airway, checking for injuries, his doctor's training overriding his father's panic. Caleb watched from where he'd collapsed, unable to move, barely able to breathe, his entire body shaking with exhaustion and shock and terror. Eleanor coughed, then coughed again, harder, her body convulsing as her lungs tried to expel smoke. Her eyes opened, unfocused, and found her father's face. "The supplies," she rasped. "I got the supplies." "You fool," Thomas said, and it was the most loving condemnation Caleb had ever heard. "You beautiful, brave, idiotic fool." Her eyes shifted, found Caleb. Recognition sparked through the pain. "You came back," she whispered. "Of course I came back." His voice was ruined from smoke. "I promised." She smiled, just slightly, then coughed again and lost consciousness. Thomas continued working, other people helping now, moving Eleanor to a place away from the smoke and heat. Caleb tried to stand, made it to his knees before someone, Sheriff Garrett, somehow mobile despite his injuries, pushed him back down. "Easy, son. You breathed in enough smoke to kill a horse. Let us handle this." "The fire? Under control. We'll lose the doctor's office and probably the building next to it, but the bucket brigades are winning. Town will survive." The sheriff's expression was grim. Question is whether it was an accident or not. "Not," Caleb said with certainty. "Too convenient. Too well-timed." "That's what I thought, too." Sheriff Garrett looked toward where townsmen were still fighting the flames. "Found evidence of accelerant in the alley. Coal oil, looks like. Someone set this deliberately. The Deacon's gang, has to be. Can't prove it yet. But the outlaw we captured, he's gone. Sometime during the chaos, someone unlocked the cell and let him walk out. Guards are both unconscious, hit from behind, professional work." Caleb felt rage cut through the exhaustion. "So there is an informant, someone in town working with them." "Looks that way, which means this isn't over, not by a long shot." The sheriff paused. "Still thinking about leaving?" Caleb looked toward where Eleanor lay, Thomas hovering over her chest rising and falling with labored breaths. He looked at the burning building that had nearly killed her, at the town that was still fighting to save itself, at the people who'd pulled him and Eleanor from the flames. He thought about his empty cabin 20 miles away, about the isolation that was supposed to keep him safe but had nearly cost him everything. "No," he said, "I'm not leaving. Even though it's more dangerous now than ever, especially because of that." Caleb finally managed to get to his feet, swaying but standing. "If someone's targeting this town because of me, then I'm staying until they're dealt with. All of them. However long it takes." Sheriff Garrett smiled despite the circumstances. "Good. Because I'm going to need help. This shoulder's going to keep me useless for weeks, and we've got a snake in our garden that needs rooting out. I'll find them. I know you will. Question is whether you're doing it just for revenge or for something more." Caleb didn't answer. He walked to where Eleanor was being tended, dropped to his knees beside her, and took her hand. Her eyes opened again, clearer this time, and she squeezed his fingers weakly. "You look terrible," she whispered. "You look beautiful." Liar. But she was smiling. "The cabin? Still standing, still mine, but I'm not living there." He paused. "If the offer's still open, the deputy position, staying in town, being part of this?" "The offer's open. Always was." Her voice was getting stronger. "What changed your mind?" "I saw what safe looked like, and then I saw you go into a burning building for medical supplies you probably couldn't even use. And I realized that you were right. Courage isn't avoiding risk. It's deciding what's worth risking everything for." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that had nothing to do with smoke. And you're worth it. Your father's worth it. This town's worth it. Being part of something larger than fear, that's worth it. Even if you lose? Even then. Because at least I'll have lived first. He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. "You asked me once what it would take to make the risk worth it. The answer is you. It's always been you." Thomas cleared his throat. "As touching as this is, my daughter needs rest and you need treatment for smoke inhalation and burns. Romance can resume after you're both not in danger of dying." But he was smiling, and when his eyes met Caleb's, there was approval there. "Welcome." They moved Eleanor to the church where other injured were being tended. Caleb refused treatment until after, keeping watch while Thomas worked. The fire was finally contained as night fell. The doctor's office reduced to smoking ruins, but the rest of town saved through the collective effort of people who refused to lose their home. As exhausted townspeople finally stopped working and started collapsing where they stood, as the immediate crisis faded into exhausted aftermath, Sheriff Garrett called a meeting in the church. "We have an enemy," he said bluntly. "Someone working with the Deacons gang, someone in this town who set that fire and freed a prisoner, someone who's trying to destroy us from within." The crowd murmured, fear and anger mixing. "But we also have something they don't," the sheriff continued. "We have each other. We have a doctor who won't stop healing even when his office burns down. We have his daughter who'll risk her life to save supplies. And we have a man who rode into fire because someone needed saving." Eyes turned toward Caleb, and he fought the urge to shrink from the attention. "Caleb Hartley has agreed to serve as deputy marshal," Sheriff Garrett announced. "He'll be helping root out whoever's behind this. And I'm asking each of you, if you know anything, see anything, hear anything, you tell him or me immediately. We're in this together, and together is how we'll survive." The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, plans for rebuilding, for increased vigilance, for the practical matters of frontier survival. Caleb found himself shaking hands, accepting thanks, being welcomed into a community he'd spent years avoiding. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was exactly what he needed. Later, sitting beside Eleanor's cot as she slept, Thomas approached and sat down with the weariness of a man who'd aged a decade in one day. "Thank you," the doctor said simply, "for saving her. She saved me first, multiple times. I suppose you're even then." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure about staying? This is more dangerous now than before." "Whoever's targeting us, they'll target you especially." "I'm sure. Not because I'm not scared, but because running doesn't work. I've tried it for years. All it did was leave me alone. And now? Now I have a reason to stand and fight." Caleb looked at Eleanor's sleeping face, peaceful despite the trauma. Turns out there are things worth dying for, which means there are things worth living for, too. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since Caleb had met him, the doctor looked genuinely at peace despite everything. My wife would have liked you. She always said the best people are the ones who've been broken and learned to heal wrong, then had to break themselves again to heal right. Did she learn that from experience? She did, and she was the strongest person I ever knew. Thomas stood, patted Caleb's shoulder. Get some rest. Tomorrow we start rebuilding. All of us. Everything that was lost. Caleb nodded but didn't move. He stayed beside Eleanor through the night, keeping watch, thinking about cabins and choices and the strange courage it took to stay instead of run. Just before dawn, Eleanor stirred, her eyes opening to find him still there. "You're staying," she said. Not a question. "I'm staying. Even though it's harder than leaving?" "Especially because of that." She smiled, and in that smile, Caleb saw his future. Not safe, not easy, but real. Worth fighting for. Worth risking everything to keep. He took her hand, and this time he didn't let go. The morning after this fire brought a clarity that had nothing to do with the smoke-scrubbed sky. Caleb stood in the ruins of the doctor's office, Thomas beside him, both men surveying the destruction with the practiced eye of people who'd learned that rebuilding was just another frontier skill. 15 years of medical records, Thomas said quietly. Treatment notes, patient histories, research observations. All gone. What you know is still here. Caleb tapped his own temple. The rest can be rebuilt. Can it? I'm not a young man anymore, Caleb. Starting over at my age. Thomas trailed off, and for the first time, Caleb heard defeat in his voice. You're not starting over, you're continuing. There's a difference. Caleb kicked at a charred beam. This building is gone, but your work isn't. Those people you saved yesterday, they're still alive because of you. That doesn't burn. Thomas looked at him with something approaching wonder. When did you become an optimist? I'm not. I'm just borrowing Eleanor's perspective until I develop my own. Caleb paused. She'd tell you that the building was never the point. The healing was. And you can do that anywhere. She would say that, wouldn't she? Thomas smiled despite the ruins surrounding them. My daughter has always been wiser than her years. I wonder where she gets it. Not from her father, apparently, since you're standing here feeling sorry for yourself instead of planning where we'll build the new office. The words were harsh, but Thomas laughed, a real laugh that cut through the morning's heaviness. You're right. You're absolutely right. He straightened, his doctor's spine returning. We'll need space quickly. Mrs. Chen mentioned her boarding house has an unused back room. Not ideal, but it would work temporarily. And long-term? There's that empty lot next to the mercantile. Better location anyway, closer to the center of town. The Thomas's energy was building now, physicians' practicality overriding emotional exhaustion. We'd need lumber, labor, funding. The territorial governor has emergency reconstruction funds. Sheriff Garrett mentioned it last month when the schoolhouse needed repairs. Caleb had been paying attention even when he'd thought he was leaving, apparently. And every man in town owes you for treating their families. They'll provide labor. You've thought about this. I've thought about a lot of things lately, including how to make staying possible. Caleb looked toward the church where Eleanor was resting. She'll want to help with the rebuilding. You know she will. She'll insist on it, even if it kills her. My daughter inherited her mother's stubbornness along with her compassion. Thomas's expression grew serious. Speaking of which, what are your intentions there? The question was blunt, fatherly, and completely justified. Caleb met Thomas's eyes directly. Honest answer? I don't know yet. I know I care about her. I know I'm willing to stay and fight for this town partly because she's in it. But I'm also still learning how to be someone who stays. Someone who builds instead of runs. He paused. I don't want to make promises I might not be able to keep. Fair enough. But let me tell you something about my daughter. She doesn't need promises. She needs presence. She needs someone who'll show up day after day, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Can you do that? I'm going to try. Then that's enough for now. Thomas extended his hand and Caleb shook it, feeling the weight of trust being extended. Welcome to the family, Deputy Hartley. May heaven help us both. They spent the morning organizing reconstruction efforts while Eleanor recovered under Mrs. Patterson's watchful eye at the boarding house. The older woman had appointed herself nurse and was taking her duties seriously enough to ban all visitors until Eleanor had proper rest. By noon, Caleb had commitments from a dozen men for labor, a promise from the mercantile owner to donate materials at cost, and a headache from navigating the politics of a community he was still learning to be part of. Sheriff Garrett found him outside the general store, looking more mobile than he had any right to be with a shoulder injury less than 2 days old. "You should be resting," Caleb said. "I'll rest when I'm dead. Right now, we have work to do." The sheriff gestured toward his office. "Found something you need to see." Inside, spread across the sheriff's desk, was a collection of items that made Caleb's stomach tighten. A map of Silver Ridge with certain buildings marked. A list of names. Thomas Whitman. Eleanor Whitman. Sheriff Garrett. And at the top, underlined twice, Caleb Hartley. Caleb. And a telegram, creased from reading. "Found these in the cell where we were holding that Garrett fellow," the sheriff said. "He didn't take them when he escaped. Either forgot in the chaos, or they weren't important once he was free." Caleb studied the map. The doctor's office was marked with an X. So was the sheriff's office, the church, and 3 residences including the boarding house where Eleanor was currently staying. "They're planning something bigger," Caleb said. "That's my read too. The fire was just the opening move. They wanted to create chaos, test our response, see how we handle crisis." Sheriff Garrett pointed to the telegram. "Read it." The message was brief and chilling. "Primary target confirmed. Secondary assets identified. Proceed with escalation. Await signal for final action." "When was this sent?" Caleb asked. 3 days before the fire, which means someone's been watching us for at least a week, maybe longer. Someone close enough to identify secondary assets, which I'm guessing means people you care about. Eleanor and Thomas. Among others, but yes, they're clearly primary targets because of their connection to you. The sheriff sat down carefully, favoring his injured shoulder. "Here's what I think is happening. Clem Deakins is in prison, but he's got resources outside. Family, gang members, people who owe him. He's orchestrating something from behind bars. Revenge, yes, but also something bigger. A statement." "What kind of statement?" "The kind that says you can't cross the Deakins gang without consequences. The kind that makes an example out of an entire town." Sheriff Garrett's voice was grim. "They're not just after you anymore, Caleb. They're after everyone you've connected with. They want to destroy what you've built here before it's even fully formed." Caleb felt cold rage settle in his chest. Not the hot, impulsive kind, but the cold, calculating kind that made men dangerous. "Then we need to move first." "Agreed. Question is how. We don't know who the informant is. Could be anyone, someone who seems trustworthy, someone who's been here for years. Until we know who's feeding information to the gang, every plan we make is compromised. So we make a plan they'll want to report, and we watch to see who reports it." The sheriff smiled slowly. "You've got a devious mind, deputy. I like it. What did you have in mind?" They spent the next hour crafting a trap. The plan was simple in concept, but required precise execution. They would spread word that Caleb was riding out to his cabin to retrieve something valuable, papers, money, something worth protecting. They'd make sure the information reached multiple people through seemingly casual conversation. Then they'd watch to see who tried to pass that information along and to whom. "It's risky," Sheriff Garrett said. "If they take the bait, you'll be the target. Again." "I'm already the target. At least this way I'm the target on my terms." Caleb looked at the map again, at all those marked locations. "And it draws them away from town, away from Eleanor and Thomas. You care about her that much?" "Apparently I do." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Then let's make this work, because if we fail, it won't just be you who pays the price." They put the plan into motion that afternoon. Caleb made a show of preparing for the ride to his cabin, mentioning to the blacksmith that he needed his horse reshod for rough country. Told the mercantile owner he'd be back in 3 days with furs to trade. Mentioned to Mrs. Chen in Eleanor's hearing that he had important documents at his cabin that needed retrieving. Each conversation was carefully staged to seem natural while ensuring the information would spread. In a town the size of Silver Ridge, gossip was currency, and news of the deputy marshal's movements would circulate within hours. Then came the hard part, telling Eleanor what he was doing. She was sitting up when he finally got past Mrs. Patterson's guard, her color better, but her eyes still shadowed with exhaustion. The moment she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. "You're leaving again," she said flatly. "For 3 days. Maybe 4. "Why?" He told her. The telegram, the map, the plan to draw out the informant. He didn't sugarcoat the danger or pretend it was anything other than what it was, bait, with him as the lure. Eleanor listened in silence, her expression growing progressively darker. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "So your brilliant plan is to make yourself a target, ride out alone, and hope whoever's trying to kill you takes the opportunity to try again?" "Essentially, yes." "That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Probably. But it draws them away from you, from your father, from everyone else they've marked on that map. And if they kill you, then at least you'll be safe." Eleanor closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, there were tears. "Do you hear yourself? You finally decide to stay, to be part of something, to let people matter. And your first instinct is still to sacrifice yourself to keep us safe. That's not love, Caleb. That's martyrdom with better intentions. What would you have me do? Wait here while they burn down the town building by building, while they target you and your father because I matter to you? I'd have you trust that we're strong enough to fight beside you instead of being protected from a distance." Her voice shook with frustration and fear. "I went into a burning building yesterday. I shot a man to save your life. I'm not some fragile thing that needs shielding. I'm a partner, or I'm nothing. If something happened to you because of me, then that would be my choice, my risk, my life." She reached for his hand, gripping it hard. "You don't get to make that decision for me. You don't get to decide I'm safer without you. I'm not." "Eleanor, listen to me. Please." Her eyes held his, fierce and unwavering. "I know you're scared. I know every person you've loved has been taken from you, and I know that makes you want to keep distance between yourself and anyone who might get hurt. But that's not protection. That's just preemptive grief. You're mourning losses that haven't happened yet instead of fighting to prevent them." The words hit like a hammer. Caleb felt his carefully constructed justifications crumble under the weight of her clarity. "I don't know how to do this any other way," he admitted. "Then learn. We'll learn together." Eleanor pulled his hand to her chest, holding it there. "If you're going to ride out and draw these people into a confrontation, then make it real. Don't make it a suicide mission dressed up as protection. Make it a plan where you actually intend to come back, where you fight to survive because you have something to survive for." "I do intend to come back." "Do you? Or are you already halfway to convincing yourself that dying for us is nobler than living with us?" Caleb wanted to argue, to defend his motives, to explain that he wasn't seeking death, just accepting its possibility in service of something larger. But Eleanor's eyes saw through all of it, saw the truth he'd been avoiding. He was terrified. Not of dying, but of living. Of letting himself build something that could be destroyed. Of loving someone enough that losing them would break him permanently. "I'm scared," he said simply. "I know, so am I. But Caleb," she squeezed his hand, "fear is just proof we're alive. It's not a reason to stop living." They sat in silence, hands joined, while Mrs. Patterson bustled about pretending not to eavesdrop. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "If you're going to do this, do it right. Take backup. Tell the sheriff exactly where you'll be and when, and come back. Not as a ghost seeking redemption, but as a man who has reasons to stay alive. Can you do that?" "I'll try." "Trying's not good enough. Promise me. Actually promise that you'll fight to come back, not just fight to protect us from a distance." Caleb looked at their joined hands, at the woman who'd seen through every wall he'd built, who'd challenged him and saved him and refused to let him hide. The woman who made him want to be brave enough to stay. "I promise," he said. "I'll come back." "Good." Eleanor released his hand, leaned back against her pillows. "Now get out of here before Mrs. Patterson decides you're tiring me and throws you out bodily. And Caleb, When you come back, we're going to have a long conversation about your tendency toward martyrdom. Looking forward to it. Liar. But she was smiling, and that smile carried him out of the boarding house and through the rest of the day's preparations. He left at dawn the next morning, Sheriff Garrett and 2 trusted deputies watching from concealed positions around town to see who might try to follow or send messages. The ride to his cabin was deliberately slow, giving anyone watching plenty of time to organize a response. Caleb reached his property by late afternoon, the cabin looking exactly as he'd left it. Solid, empty, a monument to the life he'd thought he wanted. He went through the motions of searching for non-existent documents, making sure he was visible from the surrounding forest, essentially advertising his presence. Then he waited. The attack came at dusk. 4 men, moving through the trees with the coordination of people who'd worked together before. They probably thought they were being subtle. They were wrong. Caleb had spent the afternoon preparing the cabin's surroundings, clearing sight lines, setting simple alarms, creating defensive positions. When the first man tried to approach from the north, a string of tin cans announced his presence, with cheerful rattling. "I know you're out there," Caleb called from inside the cabin. "You can come out peacefully, or we can do this the hard way." The answer was a rifle shot that splintered the door frame 6 inches from his head. Hard way it was. Caleb returned fire from the window, not aiming to kill but to pin. He needed at least one of them alive to confirm who'd sent them and who'd provided the information. The firefight that followed was brief and brutal, 4 against 1, but Caleb had position and preparation. He wounded 2, killed 1 when the man tried to rush the cabin with a knife, and watched the 4th run when he realized this wasn't the easy ambush they'd planned. Sheriff Garrett and his deputies arrived an hour later, having followed at a careful distance. They'd captured the runner and brought him back in chains. "Nice work," the sheriff said, surveying the scene. "Though I noticed you killed one. Thought we needed them alive?" "He didn't give me a choice. The other 2 should recover." Caleb gestured to where the wounded men lay tied and disarmed. "One of them's been talking, says they were hired through an intermediary in Billings, someone who claimed to represent Clem Deakins' interests." "The intermediary have a name?" "Samuel Finch. Operates a saloon on the north end, known associate of the Deakins family." Sheriff Garrett smiled coldly. "Now we're getting somewhere. Who's our informant in Silver Ridge?" "That's where it gets interesting." Caleb pulled out a folded paper one of the wounded men had been carrying. "Letter of instruction. Tells them where to find me, when to strike. Signed with initials, J.F." "J.F.?" The sheriff frowned. "That could be anyone." "Could be. Except this letter was written on stationery from the Silver Ridge Mercantile. See the watermark? And the handwriting matches ledgers I saw in the store yesterday." "Joseph Foster." Sheriff Garrett's expression darkened. "The Mercantile owner. He's been here for 5 years. Respected, trusted. And apparently selling information to outlaws." Caleb kept his voice neutral. "Question is why? Money? Threats? Ideology? Does it matter? To the law, no. To understanding how deep this goes, yes." They bound the wounded men, loaded them onto horses, and made the ride back to Silver Ridge through the night. Caleb was exhausted, running on determination and the promise he'd made to Eleanor. He would come back. He would survive. He would fight for the life he was building instead of the death he'd been courting. They reached town as dawn broke, and Caleb went straight to the boarding house. Eleanor was awake, sitting by the window as if she'd been watching the road all night. When she saw him, dirty, bloody, but alive, her face transformed with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "You came back," she said. "I promised." "People break promises." "I don't. Not anymore." Caleb crossed the room, and before he could overthink it, before fear could reassert control, he kissed her. It was clumsy, desperate, tasting of smoke and survival and something that might have been hope. Eleanor kissed him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, pulling him closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she was crying. "Don't ever do that again," she whispered. "The kissing or the riding into danger?" "The riding into danger without me. If you're going to risk your life, I'm going to be there to save it. We're partners now. Act like it." "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat from the doorway. "If you 2 are quite finished with your dramatic reunion, there's work to be done. The sheriff's arrested Joseph Foster, and half the town is gathered outside demanding answers. They emerged to find Silver Ridge in controlled chaos. Foster was in chains in the sheriff's office, and Thomas was addressing an angry crowd trying to explain that mob justice wasn't justice at all. Caleb and Eleanor made their way through, and when people saw them together, the deputy who'd survived an ambush and the doctor's daughter who'd survived a fire, a strange calm descended. "Tell them what you found," Sheriff Garrett said to Caleb. So he did. He explained the telegram, the ambush, the captured men who'd confirmed Foster's involvement. He showed them the letter with its damning initials and mercantile stationery, and he watched as shock and anger rippled through the crowd. "Why?" someone shouted. "Why would Joseph betray us?" Foster, visible through the sheriff's office window, looked smaller than Caleb remembered, diminished by his choices. When the sheriff brought him out to speak, his voice was barely audible. "They threatened my family," Foster said. "I have a sister in Helena, a niece, the Deacons gang. They said if I didn't provide information, they'd hurt them. I didn't want to. I tried to give them nothing important, but they kept demanding more. The fire, the ambush, I didn't know it would go that far. I swear I didn't know." "You knew enough," Sheriff Garrett said coldly. "You chose your family over your community. I understand that impulse. But you made a choice, and now you'll face the consequences." The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later, a hard man with harder eyes who'd seen every variation of frontier crime and remained unimpressed by all of it. He took statements, processed prisoners, and confirmed what Caleb and the sheriff had already concluded. The attack had been coordinated by remnants of the Deacons gang operating out of Billings, with Foster as their local informant. "We'll round up the rest," the marshal promised. "Might take months, but we'll get them. Clem Deacons will hang for conspiracy to murder, and his associates will join him. Your town should be safe." "Should be," Eleanor repeated after the marshal had left. "That's reassuring." "It's the best we get out here," Caleb said. They were sitting on the porch of what would become the new doctor's office, watching construction progress. In just 3 days, the frame had gone up, walls were being built, and Thomas was already organizing where supplies would go. Certainty is a luxury. We live with probabilities and do our best. And what are the probabilities that another gang will come looking for revenge? That some cousin or friend of the Deacons brothers will decide to continue the vendetta? Low but not zero. That's frontier math. Caleb took her hand. "But that's true whether I stay or go. The difference is, if I stay, we face it together. If I go, you face it alone. I know which option I prefer." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "I'm still angry with you, for trying to be noble and martyred instead of just being present. I know. And I'm going to remind you of it regularly, probably for years. I'm counting on it. You're a strange man, Caleb Hartley. And you're a strange woman for wanting to be with one." She laughed, and the sound was better than music. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the town rebuild, watching their neighbors work together with the resilience that defined frontier communities. Silver Ridge would survive. It would thrive, and Caleb would be part of that. The wedding happened in October, 6 months after the fire, after the new doctor's office was complete and the last of the Deacons gang members had been arrested. It was a simple ceremony in the church that had served as hospital during the crisis. Sheriff Garrett officiating since the regular minister was away, Thomas walking Eleanor down an aisle barely wide enough for 2 people, half the town crammed into pews designed for a third that number. Eleanor wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, and carried wildflowers Caleb had picked that morning from the meadows near his cabin. Caleb wore his best shirt, still not very good, and boots polished to within an inch of their life by Mrs. Chen, who'd appointed herself unofficial wedding coordinator. "Do you, Caleb Hartley, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live?" Caleb looked at Eleanor, at the woman who'd seen through his walls, who'd challenged him to be brave enough to stay, who'd shot a man to save his life and walked into fire to save medical supplies she could barely carry. The woman who'd taught him that surviving wasn't enough, that love was worth the risk, that connection was stronger than isolation. "I do," he said, and meant it with every scarred and healing part of his soul. And do you, Eleanor Whitman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for as long as you both shall live? Eleanor's eyes were bright with tears and joy in equal measure. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife. Caleb, you may kiss your bride. And make it good. We've all been waiting months for this. The church erupted in laughter and applause as Caleb kissed Eleanor, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt something he'd thought was lost forever. He felt home. The reception was held at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, food contributed by every family in town, music provided by the blacksmith who turned out to be surprisingly good on the fiddle. They danced, badly, since neither of them knew how, and laughed at their own clumsiness and didn't care who was watching. As the sun set and the party continued, Caleb and Eleanor slipped away to the porch, needing a moment of quiet in the celebration. Having regrets yet? Eleanor asked. About marrying you? None. About the dancing? Several. She laughed and tucked herself against his side, fitting there like she'd been designed for it. What are you thinking about? About a cabin I built to hide in. About 300 acres I bought to isolate myself. About all the years I spent convinced that survival meant staying alone. And now? Now I'm thinking about turning that cabin into something else. A place we can go when we need quiet, but not to hide. A place with room for... He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Room for what? For a family. Eventually. If you want that. Eleanor was quiet for so long Caleb started to worry he'd overstepped. Then she turned to look at him, and her eyes held the same fierce joy he'd seen when he'd emerged from that burning building. I want that, she said simply. I want to build something with you, a home, a practice, a life, all of it. Even knowing it's dangerous, that my past might come back again, that frontier life is hard and uncertain, and she kissed him to stop the words. Especially knowing all that, because that's what makes it worth fighting for. Not the guarantee of safety, but the choice to build something beautiful anyway. They stood on that porch as night fell over Silver Ridge, wrapped in each other and the future they were choosing to create. Around them, the town continued its celebration. People who'd survived fire and violence and the 1,000 small crises of frontier existence, who'd come together to rebuild and protect and endure. Caleb had spent years believing strength meant standing alone, that survival required isolation, that love was just another name for eventual loss. Eleanor had taught him different. She'd shown him that real strength was standing together, that survival meant connection, not isolation, that love, messy, terrifying, worth every risk love, was what made life more than just existence. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth saving when I'd convinced myself there wasn't. Eleanor smiled and kissed him again. You saved yourself, Caleb. I just refused to let you do it alone. They stayed on that porch long after the party had wound down, after the last guests had departed, after the town had settled into sleep. Two people who'd been broken in different ways, who'd found each other in a tiny Montana town at the edge of wilderness, who'd chosen to build instead of run, to stay instead of hide, to love instead of fear. The cabin still stood on those 300 acres, waiting, but now it was just a cabin, not a fortress, not a hiding place, just a structure made of logs and effort and an old dream of safety through isolation. Caleb and Eleanor would go there sometimes, when they needed space to breathe. They'd fix it up, make it comfortable, turn it into something warm instead of cold. And eventually they'd bring their children there, teach them about the land and the wilderness and the strange courage it takes to choose connection over safety. But it would never be home. Not really. Home was Silver Ridge. Home was the new doctor's office where Thomas and Eleanor practiced medicine side by side. Home was the sheriff's office where Caleb continued to serve as deputy, keeping the peace and protecting the people he'd learned to let matter. Home was the boarding house dinners and the church gatherings and the 1,000 small interactions that made up community. Home was Eleanor standing beside him through everything the frontier could throw at them. Years later, when Caleb was older and scarred from a lifetime of frontier service, when Silver Ridge had grown from a town of 300 to nearly 1,000, when Montana was no longer a territory but a state, someone asked him if he regretted not choosing the isolation he'd originally planned. He thought about it, really thought about it. About the cabin that still stood on land he still owned, about the years of loneliness that had preceded his arrival in Silver Ridge, about the walls he'd built and the armor he'd worn and the philosophy that had kept him alive but not living. Then he looked at Eleanor still by his side after decades, their children grown and scattered but returning often because home meant something. He looked at the town they'd helped build and defend. He looked at the life they'd created through choice and courage and stubborn refusal to let fear win. "No," he said simply. "I don't regret a single day." Because he'd learned what Eleanor had tried to teach him from the beginning, that isolation isn't safety, it's just loneliness with better excuses. That love isn't weakness, it's the greatest courage any person can summon. That the risk of loss is the price of connection, and connection is what makes life worth the risk. His parents had died in fire. Dutch had died in his arms. Every person he'd loved in his early life had been taken by violence and chance and the cruel randomness of frontier existence. But they'd lived first. They'd loved first. They'd mattered first. And in choosing to stay in Silver Ridge and choosing Eleanor and Thomas and a community over comfortable isolation, Caleb had finally understood. You can't avoid grief by avoiding love. You can only avoid living. He'd chosen to live. And that made all the difference. The Montana wilderness stretched vast and indifferent around Silver Ridge, just as it always had. Mountains rose sharp against the sky. Seasons turned with brutal efficiency. The frontier gave nothing without demanding payment. But in that tiny town, in a doctor's office that had risen from ashes, in the home Caleb and Eleanor had built log by log and choice by choice, there was warmth. There was laughter. There was the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of people who'd decided that connection was worth defending, that love was worth the risk, that staying was braver than running. Caleb Hartley had come to Montana to hide. Instead, he'd found a reason to live. And in the end, Eleanor's eyes had captured his soul, not by force, but by invitation, by seeing him clearly and deciding he was worth the trouble, by refusing to let him choose safety over life. She'd given him the greatest gift anyone could give, the courage to stay, and he'd given her the same in return. Together, they'd built something worth risking everything to keep. Together, they'd proved that even in a wilderness designed to break people, love could be the strongest foundation of all. That was their story. That was their victory. And it was more than enough.